Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I didn't think it would be a big deal, driving back late at night. I've done it plenty of times before. It was supposed to be a short trip to visit my sister, just 3 hours away. I wasn't in a rush, so when the weather turned, I figured I'd slow down and be careful. It was drizzling on and off, nothing major at first. But I was wrong. So wrong. The rain picked up around 11 p.m., turning the road slick, and that's when I started having trouble. My car, this old sedan I had for years, began making strange sounds. I ignored it at first. I just wanted to get home. About half an hour later, though, the noises got worse, like something grinding. Then it happened, the engine gave out, and the car slowed to a stop, right in the middle of nowhere. I tried starting it again. Nothing. The lights flickered, the engine clicked, but it wouldn't turn over. I sat there, gripping the wheel, staring out at the rain-soaked road. There wasn't a single car passing by. It was just me, the rain, and the dead silence of the empty highway. I glanced at my phone. No service. I was at least 20 miles from the last town I'd passed through, maybe more. I'm not great with cars, but I thought maybe it was something simple, like the battery or the alternator. I got out, popped the hood, and stared at the engine as if it would magically fix itself. I stood there for a while, the rain soaking me through, before realizing I was just wasting time. I couldn't fix it, and no one was around. So I got back in the car, locked the doors, and figured I'd wait it out. Someone had to drive by eventually, right? It must have been an hour later when I saw headlights in the distance, cutting through the rain. My heart jumped. I thought about waving them down, but I was cautious. It was late, and I was alone. But when the vehicle got closer, it slowed, and I saw it was a large truck. A semi. The truck came to a stop just ahead of me, and the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, middle-aged, with a scruffy beard, wearing a baseball cap and a rain jacket. He waved and started walking toward me. Everything inside me screamed not to open the door, but I didn't want to be rude. Maybe he was just trying to help. I cracked the window just a bit, enough to hear him. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice a little too casual for my liking. "Yeah," I said. "I think it's the engine. I've got a tow truck coming." That was a lie, but I didn't want to seem desperate. He didn't seem to believe me. He glanced at my car, then back at me. "Mind if I take a look?" I hesitated. I didn't want to get out of the car, but at the same time, he was offering help. Maybe he knew what he was doing, or maybe he just wanted to get on his way and would leave me alone if I let him check. So, against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and stepped out. The rain was still coming down hard, and we both stood there by the front of the car. He bent over, pretending to inspect the engine, while I stood awkwardly beside him. After a minute, he straightened up and shrugged. "Looks bad. You're not going anywhere tonight, that's for sure." I nodded, trying to hide the unease creeping up my spine. "I'll just wait for the tow, then." He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. "You're pretty far from town. I've got room in my truck if you want a lift. I can drop you at a motel." The way he said it, too casually, like it was no big deal, sent alarms ringing in my head. I shook my head quickly. "No, thanks. I'll be fine here." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Come on, it's pouring out here. You're gonna be waiting a long time. I tried to sound firm, though my voice shook. I'll be fine. Really. I don't want to leave my car. That's when his whole demeanor changed. His smile faded and his eyes darkened. He stepped closer, and I instinctively took a step back. It's not safe for a woman to be out here alone, he said, his voice low, almost threatening. You don't know what kind of people might come by. My heart raced. I tried to step around him, but he moved to block me. Look, I said no, I repeated, louder this time, hoping my voice didn't betray the fear I felt. I'm waiting for the tow truck. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could feel the tension thick in the air. I thought he was going to grab me, drag me to his truck. My hands were trembling, and my throat went dry. Then, out of nowhere, headlights appeared in the distance. Another car, coming down the road. The man glanced over his shoulder, his expression changing again. His posture relaxed, and he stepped back, giving me space. All right, he said, his voice calm again. Suit yourself. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his truck. I stood there, frozen, as he climbed into the cab, started the engine, and pulled away. The headlights of the approaching car grew brighter, and I ran back to my car, locking the doors as fast as I could. My whole body was shaking. I sat there, watching as the car drove past, not even slowing down. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My mind was racing with what could have happened, what almost did. It felt like hours before I managed to pull myself together. I kept the doors locked, and I didn't dare leave the car again. Eventually, the rain slowed, and my phone finally picked up a signal. I called for a real tow truck this time, and when they arrived, I couldn't explain why I was so shaken. I just wanted to get out of there, away from the empty road, away from the dark and the rain. The trucker didn't come back, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see his headlights in the rearview mirror. Even now, I can't drive down a quiet road without thinking about that night, how easily it could have gone wrong. I was on my way to a friend's place, driving through what I thought were just back roads in some rural area. I had left late, which was stupid, but I figured it would be a quick drive. The GPS signal was spotty the entire time, but I thought I knew where I was going. I didn't. The roads twisted around, and after a while, I had no clue where I was. It was just endless farmland, and my phone had completely lost signal. I kept telling myself I'd see a main road soon, but nothing. Just empty fields and the occasional patch of trees. The sun had gone down an hour ago, and now it was pitch black outside, except for my headlights lighting up the road in front of me. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for two cars, though I hadn't seen a single one since I'd taken that wrong turn, wherever it was. I was running low on gas too, so I knew I needed to figure something out fast. That's when I saw it, a faint light up ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was coming from an old farmhouse sitting back from the road. It was the first sign of life I'd seen in what felt like forever. I figured it was worth a shot. I didn't really want to bother anyone, but I was getting desperate. I pulled off the road and drove down the long, dirt driveway toward the house. The tires crunched on the gravel, and as I got closer, I could make out more of the place. The house was old, real old, with peeling paint and sagging roof lines. There were a few outbuildings too, a barn and some sheds, all looking like they hadn't been used in years. A single light was on inside, glowing faintly through the front window. I parked and got out, immediately feeling the chill of the night air. The place was dead quiet, except for the sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I walked up to the door and knocked, feeling uneasy but hoping someone could help. After a minute, the door creaked open and an old man stood there. He must have been in his late 70s, maybe older, with deep lines on his face and a worn, plaid shirt hanging loosely on his thin frame. His gray hair stuck out in all directions, like he hadn't bothered to comb it in a while. His eyes were sharp, though, and they locked onto me the second he opened the door. "Evening," he said, his voice gravelly. "You lost?" I nodded. "Yeah, I took a wrong turn somewhere. My phone's not working, and I was hoping you could point me in the right direction." The old man didn't say anything for a moment, just looked me over, like he was sizing me up. Then, after what felt like forever, he smiled a thin, almost forced smile. "Well, come on in. Got a map inside somewhere. You can warm up too, it's cold out here." I hesitated, but he stepped back, holding the door open wider. I didn't really have any other options, so I stepped inside. The place smelled old, like dust and something I couldn't quite place. The furniture looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, with worn-out couches and a coffee table that was covered in old newspapers. There were no family pictures, no sign of anyone else living there. Just him. He led me into the kitchen, where there was a small table with 2 chairs. The light over the table was dim, casting long shadows on the walls. "Sit," he said, pointing to one of the chairs. I sat down, feeling more uneasy by the second. Something about the way he moved, slow and deliberate, made me nervous. He rummaged through a drawer, muttering to himself, before pulling out a dusty old map. He spread it out on the table in front of me. "Where you headed?" he asked, his eyes flicking up to meet mine. I told him the name of the town I was trying to get to, and he nodded slowly, tracing a path with his finger. "You're way off," he said, "but I can get you back on track. First, how about a drink? You look like you've had a rough night." I started to decline, but before I could say anything, he was already grabbing a bottle from the counter and pouring something into a glass. He handed it to me, the liquid sloshing a bit as he did. "It'll warm you up," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. I took the glass, though I had no intention of drinking it. I just wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. The air in the room felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I noticed the locks. Every window in the kitchen had thick, heavy locks on them, the kind you'd use to keep something or someone inside. And the door I'd just come through had 3 separate deadbolts, all of them locked now. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard him lock the door, but it was locked all the same. I glanced around, trying to stay calm. "Something wrong?" the old man asked, his voice low. He was watching me, waiting. I shook my head, forcing a smile. "No, I should probably get going." He didn't move. Just stood there, blocking the doorway. "You sure? You just got here. Why don't you finish your drink?" I glanced down at the glass, the liquid inside looking darker than it should. My heart was racing now. Every instinct was telling me to get out, but I couldn't see how. The door was locked, and he was between me and it. "I'm good, really," I said, standing up slowly. "Thanks for the help, but I'll be on my way." The old man's smile faded, replaced with a cold, hard look. "Sit down," he said, his voice flat. I froze. He took a step closer, and I backed up, bumping into the table behind me. I said, "Sit down." I glanced at the door again, calculating. If I could make it past him, maybe I could get out, but he was closer now, too close. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could feel the sweat forming on the back of my neck. I didn't sit. I couldn't. I turned, making a break for the back door I'd noticed earlier, the one leading out to the yard. The old man lunged for me, but I was faster, slamming into the door and fumbling with the lock. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get it open, but finally, the latch clicked, and I shoved the door open just as I heard him yell behind me. I ran. I didn't look back. The night was cold, and the wind stung my face, but I kept running, my legs burning as I sprinted across the yard toward the driveway. My car was still there, thank God, and I dove in, locking the doors behind me. I fumbled for the keys, my hands trembling, and jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life. As I peeled out of the driveway, I saw the old man standing on the porch, watching me. His face was blank, no emotion at all, like he'd expected me to run. I didn't stop driving until I was back on a main road, the lights of a small town finally coming into view. It took me hours to calm down, and even now, I can't shake the feeling that he wasn't just some old farmer. I've always been the type of person who enjoys hiking alone. It's peaceful, you know? No noise except for the sounds of the forest. It was a Saturday morning, clear skies, the perfect day to get out. I packed light water, some snacks, a map, and my phone. I knew the trail well enough, but it was a long one through the national forest, and I liked having some sense of direction if I needed it. The first couple of hours were fine, just me and the trees, not a soul in sight. That's what I liked most about it. No distractions. No one else around. The path was a little more rugged than I remembered, though. Lots of roots and uneven ground. I guess I wasn't paying attention when it happened. 1 second, I was walking, and the next, I was on the ground. I must have tripped, but all I could think about was the pain shooting up from my ankle. I tried to get up, but my leg gave out under me. I reached down, and my ankle was already swelling up, hot and throbbing. It was bad, real bad. I knew I wasn't walking out of there on my own. I sat there for a while, hoping someone else would come along. But it's a quiet trail, one that not many people take, especially on weekdays. I didn't have much luck with my phone either. No signal out here, of course. I felt the panic start to rise, but I tried to push it down. It was still early in the day, and maybe someone would come by. I just had to wait. It must have been an hour, maybe more, before I heard the footsteps. They were slow, heavy, and at first, I wasn't sure if they were real or if I was just imagining it, hoping too much. But then I saw him. A man, mid-40s maybe, with a scruffy beard and a worn-out baseball cap. He was walking down the path toward me, carrying a small pack on his back. He noticed me right away, saw me sitting on the ground, and his face shifted, like he was surprised to see anyone out there. "You all right?" he asked, stopping a few feet away. I shook my head, explaining what had happened, how I couldn't walk on my ankle, how there was no signal on my phone. He looked at my ankle, nodding slowly, then back at me. "That looks pretty bad," he said. "You're not getting out of here on your own." I nodded, trying not to let the fear show on my face. "Can you help me? Maybe call someone?" He hesitated, which was strange. It was only for a second, but I noticed it. Then he scratched his beard, looked around like he was thinking something over. "I don't have a phone with me," he said, "but I've got a cabin not too far from here. Just off the trail. I can take you there, and we can figure something out." Something about the way he said it made me nervous. But what choice did I have? I wasn't going anywhere, and I needed help. I wasn't about to spend the night out there with no way to move. "All right," I said. But are you sure it's close? I don't want to be a bother. He smiled, a little too wide. It's close enough. I'll carry you. You're not heavy. Before I could say anything else, he was already lifting me up. His hands were rough, and he hoisted me onto his back like it was no problem at all. I felt a bit of relief, thinking maybe I was lucky to have run into someone. He started walking, stepping off the trail and heading deeper into the woods. As he carried me, I noticed the trees were getting thicker. We were going deeper than I'd expected, farther away from the trail. I tried to make conversation, asked him how long he'd lived in the area, how often he came to the woods. He answered, but the responses were short, clipped. He didn't seem all that interested in talking. After what felt like forever, we reached his cabin. It was small, just a single-story structure with a slanted roof, tucked away between the trees. The wood was weathered, and the windows were dark. There was no car outside, no sign that anyone else had been there in a long time. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. He set me down on the porch and opened the door. Inside, it was just as simple. A single room with a stove, a table, a couple of chairs, and a bed in the corner. I noticed right away there was no phone. Nothing modern, really. Just old furniture and a few lanterns for light. Go ahead and sit down, he said, motioning to the table. I'll get you some water. I hobbled over to the chair, trying not to put weight on my ankle. The cabin felt cold, even though it was still warm outside. I watched as he grabbed a jug of water from the counter and poured it into a glass. He set it in front of me, then sat down across the table, just staring at me for a second. I shifted uncomfortably, looking around for anything I hadn't noticed before. There was something unsettling about the place. "Where's the phone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "No phone," he said simply. "Don't need one out here." I felt my chest tighten. How am I supposed to call for help? He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "I told you, we'll figure something out. You're not going anywhere on that ankle tonight anyway." Something about the way he said it sent a chill through me. I felt trapped. The windows were small, covered with thick curtains, and the door was solid wood, probably heavy to move. I started to realize just how isolated we were. There was no one around for miles. "I really appreciate the help," I said, trying to sound calm, "but I think I should try to get back to the trail. Someone else might come by." He didn't move, didn't even blink. "It's late," he said. "No one's coming by now. You should just stay the night." I stared at him, trying to think of something to say, but my mind was racing. Every instinct was telling me to leave, to get out of there as fast as I could. But my ankle, I couldn't walk on it. "I'll be fine," I said, forcing a smile. "I can manage." He stood up then, moving around the table toward me. His eyes were cold, unreadable. "You're not leaving," he said quietly. "Not tonight." My heart started pounding. I pushed myself up, trying to stand, but my ankle gave out, and I nearly fell. He grabbed my arm, holding me steady, but his grip was too tight, like he wasn't going to let go. "Sit down," he said, his voice low and dangerous. I sat back down, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't run, not with my ankle like this. I looked around the cabin again, trying to spot anything that might help me, but there was nothing. Just that old furniture and the thick walls keeping me inside. He sat back down, watching me closely. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe if I just stayed quiet, stayed calm, he'd let his guard down. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized he had no intention of letting me leave. Hours passed like that. I pretended to drink the water, but my throat was too dry, too tight. Every now and then, he would get up and walk to the door, checking it, making sure it was locked. Then he'd sit back down, just staring at me. I felt like a rabbit caught in a trap, waiting for the inevitable. At one point, he got up and went to the stove, lighting a fire. The room filled with warmth, but it didn't make me feel any safer. He turned to me, his face lit by the glow of the fire, and smiled. "You'll be fine here," he said. "No one's gonna find you." My stomach dropped. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. "I need to use the bathroom," I said suddenly, my voice shaking. He pointed to a door at the back of the cabin, never taking his eyes off me. I got up slowly, limping to the door, my heart racing. I had no plan, no idea what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't stay there. Once I was inside, I locked the door behind me and looked around. The bathroom was small, just a sink and a toilet, with a tiny window above the sink. It was small, but it was my only chance. I hobbled over, pulled myself up onto the counter, and tried to open the window. It was stuck, painted shut probably years ago. I felt panic rising in my chest. I tugged harder, putting all my weight into it, and finally, it gave way with a loud creak. I froze, listening for any sign that he'd heard, but there was nothing. I squeezed through the window, my ankle screaming in pain, but I didn't care. I had to get out. The drop to the ground wasn't far, but it hurt like hell when I landed. I bit back a scream, forcing myself to stand. I couldn't put any weight on my ankle, but I had to move. I limped into the trees, trying to get as far from the cabin as possible. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just needed to get away. I could hear him now, yelling from the cabin, but I didn't stop. The trees were thick, and I used them to keep myself steady, moving as fast as I could. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. Eventually, I stumbled onto a dirt road, and by some miracle, there was a car coming. I flagged them down, barely able to speak through the pain and fear. They helped me into the car, and I told them what happened, though I'm not sure I made much sense. They called the police, and they took me to the hospital. I never saw that man again, but I'll never forget his face. The way he smiled when he told me no one was coming. I was driving across the country, headed from one coast to the other. I'd done it before, but this time I decided to take a different route, away from the highways. I was tired of the same old roads, the endless lines of cars, and all the noise. I thought maybe it would be nice to see more of the country, take in the back roads, the quiet places. That was a mistake. It was around dusk when I realized I had taken a wrong turn. I wasn't sure when it happened exactly. The GPS on my phone had been working fine, but then I lost signal somewhere around noon. The road I was on started to change. What was once a two-lane asphalt road turned into a narrow dirt path. It wasn't supposed to be that way. My map had shown a solid road, but I figured I'd stay on it for a bit longer, assuming it would connect back to the main highway eventually. As the sun went down, the road only got worse. Trees on either side of me started closing in, branches reaching out over the road, blocking the last bits of light. It was like the woods were swallowing me up. I hadn't seen a house or a person for miles. Not even another car. Just endless forest. The only sounds were my tires crunching over the gravel and the occasional thud of a rock hitting the underside of my car. I was getting nervous, but I didn't have a choice but to keep going. The road was too narrow to turn around, and I wasn't about to reverse my way out of there for who knows how long. My gas was low, not empty, but low enough that I needed to find my way back to civilization soon. I figured I could make it another hour or so before I really needed to worry. The light faded fast, and soon it was pitch dark. I had my headlights on, but they weren't doing much. The dirt road seemed to twist and curve without end, and every time I thought I was nearing the end, another bend would come up. My heart was starting to pound harder, that tight feeling in your chest when you know something's not right. It was too quiet, too isolated. There was something about the way the road stretched on that felt wrong, unnatural almost. I tried to shake the thought from my head, focusing on driving. That's when I saw him. He was standing right in the middle of the road, about 50 feet ahead, just inside the reach of my headlights. At first, I thought maybe it was just a shadow, or maybe a deer or something, but no. It was a man. His hand was out, like he was trying to flag me down. I slowed the car down to a crawl, my stomach flipping. Something about him didn't sit right with me. He wasn't dressed like a normal hitchhiker or someone who was lost. His clothes were dirty, like he'd been out there for a long time. His hair was matted, and I could see his face was pale, even from that distance. I should have stopped right there. I should have turned the car around, or done anything but keep going, but I didn't. I thought maybe he was in trouble. Maybe he needed help. I couldn't just leave someone out there, could I? It didn't feel right. So, I kept driving forward, but slowly. My fingers were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were turning white. When I got close enough, I rolled down the window just a bit, maybe an inch or two, enough to hear him, but not enough for him to reach inside. The air outside was cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaking a little. "Do you need help?" The man just stood there, staring at me. His eyes were wide, and there was something in them that made my skin crawl. He didn't move, didn't respond. Just stared. I was about to roll the window back up when he suddenly took a step toward the car, his hand still out. "I need a ride," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. My heart was racing now. Everything inside me was screaming to drive away, but I hesitated. I didn't want to leave him stranded. What if he really was in trouble? But something about him felt wrong, off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like he didn't belong there. Like he wasn't supposed to be out in the middle of nowhere, on this road, at this time of night. "I don't think I can help," I said, my voice a little firmer now. "I'm lost myself." The man took another step forward, his hand still out, palm up, like he was expecting me to just reach out and take it. His eyes never left mine, and I could see something in them now that made my blood run cold. There was no fear in his eyes, no desperation. Just something else. Something I couldn't understand. "Please," he said, his voice soft. "I've been out here a long time." I shook my head, my gut telling me not to trust him. "I'm sorry, I really can't." I rolled the window up all the way and put the car in gear, my foot pressing down on the gas. The car lurched forward, and for a moment, I thought it was over. I thought I could just drive away, leave him behind. But as I passed him, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and what I saw made my heart stop. He was running after me. I floored the gas, the car bouncing over the uneven road, my headlights barely illuminating the path ahead. I glanced back again, and he was still there, sprinting after the car, his arms pumping, his face twisted in some kind of sick grin. How was he keeping up? I was going at least 30 miles an hour, but he wasn't slowing down. Panic took over, and I pushed the car faster, the engine whining as I swerved around the bends in the road. The trees blurred past me, and I could feel the car struggling to keep traction on the loose dirt. I was sure I was going to crash, but I didn't care. I had to get away from him. I looked back again, and this time, he was gone. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I kept driving, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away. I had to keep moving. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a light up ahead. A gas station, small and run down, but it was the first sign of civilization I'd seen in miles. I pulled in, my tires screeching as I came to a stop. I jumped out of the car, my legs shaking, and ran inside. The clerk looked up from behind the counter, startled by how I burst through the door. I must have looked like a mess, sweaty, pale, and terrified. "You all right?" he asked, his voice calm, like he'd seen worse. I need help," I managed to say, my voice trembling. There was a man, back on the road. The clerk just nodded, like he knew what I was talking about. He didn't ask any questions, didn't seem surprised. He just pointed to a phone on the wall. I called the police, told them what happened. They sent someone out to check the road, but they didn't find anyone. No man, no signs of anyone being out there. Just a long, empty dirt road in the middle of nowhere. I don't know who that man was, or what he wanted, but I'll never forget the way he looked at me. The way he smiled as he chased after my car, like he knew something I didn't. Something I didn't want to know. I haven't taken a back road since. It was supposed to be a fresh start. We thought we had done everything right. No social media, no contact with anyone we used to know. We even got rid of our phones, bought a beat-up old car with cash, and rented a cabin so far into the woods that the nearest town was an hour away. We wanted to disappear. I guess, in the end, we were naive to think we could. The cabin wasn't much. A small, run-down place with creaky floors and windows that let the cold in. The kind of place that would seem charming if you weren't actually living in it. But it had one thing we desperately needed: isolation. No neighbors for miles, nothing but trees and silence. For the first time in months, I felt like we could breathe, even though every night I'd lay awake, listening for anything out of place. It had been about 3 months since we left. Life had been quiet, just the two of us. John spent his days chopping wood, fixing up the place as best he could, while I tried to keep my mind busy with cooking, cleaning, anything to avoid the thoughts that kept creeping back. But no matter how peaceful it seemed, that feeling of unease never really went away. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to go wrong. That night, I knew something wasn't right the moment the sun went down. It was colder than usual, the wind howling through the trees, making the old windows rattle. We had finished dinner, and John was sitting by the fire, flipping through an old magazine he'd found in a drawer. I was washing dishes, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled in my stomach, but it was hard to ignore. I felt restless, like I needed to check outside, to make sure everything was still as it should be. I tried my hands and went to the window, the one that faced the driveway, though calling it a driveway was generous. It was really just a dirt path leading up to the cabin, surrounded by thick trees on either side. Nothing moved out there, just shadows swaying with the wind. I was about to turn away when I saw it, just a flicker at first, barely noticeable through the trees, but enough to catch my attention. A light. I squinted, trying to focus on where it was coming from. My heart started racing when I realized it was a flashlight, moving slowly through the trees, coming closer to the cabin. "John," I said, my voice shaking more than I intended. He didn't look up from the magazine. "John, there's someone outside." That got his attention. He stood up, crossing the room in a few quick strides. He looked out the window, his face hardening when he saw the light. Without a word, he went to the front door and grabbed the shotgun we kept leaning against the wall, just in case. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. I wanted to argue, to tell him we should call the police, but we both knew that wasn't an option. No phone, no service, no help. We were on our own. I followed him to the door anyway, standing behind him as he cracked it open just enough to step outside. The cold air hit me like a slap, the wind carrying with it a faint sound of voices, barely audible but unmistakable. There were more than one of them, and they were getting closer. John moved off the porch, staying low as he made his way toward the side of the cabin where the flashlight beam was coming from. I stayed by the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I could hear the voices now, clearer, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was a mix of low murmurs and laughter, the kind of sound that makes your skin crawl when you know it shouldn't be there. I peeked out from the doorway, just enough to see John crouched by the side of the cabin, his shotgun raised as he watched the light move through the trees. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Then the light stopped. The voices stopped. Everything was quiet again, too quiet. For a moment, I thought maybe they had left, that whoever it was had decided to move on. But then I saw movement. A shadow, just beyond the tree line, stepping out into the open. A man. And not just any man. My heart dropped into my stomach when I recognized him. It was Mark. He was supposed to be in prison, locked up for years after everything that had happened. But there he was, standing in front of our cabin, his face twisted into that same smug grin I had seen so many times before. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. How had he found us? We had been so careful. We had left everything behind, erased ourselves from the map. But somehow, he had tracked us down. John must have seen him too because he straightened up, his grip tightening on the shotgun. He didn't fire though, not yet. He was waiting, assessing the situation, trying to figure out how many more of them were out there. "Come on out, now," Mark called, his voice mocking, like this was all a game to him. "We know you're in there. Let's not make this harder than it has to be." I felt sick. There was no way we were getting out of this. Even if John fired, even if we managed to take down Mark, there were others out there. I could hear them moving through the trees, circling the cabin, cutting off any escape routes we might have had. John backed up slowly, coming toward the door, his eyes never leaving Mark. He was calm, too calm, like he had already accepted what was about to happen. "We're not coming out," he said, his voice steady. "Leave now, or I'll shoot." Mark laughed, that same cold, humorless laugh I'd heard 1,000 times before. "You really think you can stop us?" he said. "There's no one coming to help you. You're alone out here. Might as well come out and face it." John didn't respond. He just stood there, the shotgun aimed at Mark's chest, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed John's arm, pulling him back inside the cabin. "We need to barricade the doors," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We can't let them get in." John hesitated, but then he nodded. We slammed the door shut and pushed the old wooden table in front of it, followed by a chair and anything else we could find. The windows were too small for anyone to climb through, but I wasn't taking any chances. I grabbed a hammer from the kitchen drawer and started nailing the window shutters shut, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the nails. All the while, Mark kept talking, his voice drifting through the cracks in the door, taunting us. "You can't hide forever," he said. "We'll get in eventually. It's just a matter of time. I didn't know how long we could hold out. The cabin wasn't exactly a fortress. The walls were thin, the locks old and rusted. If they wanted to break in, they could. It was only a matter of when. I could hear them outside, their footsteps crunching over the gravel, the low murmur of their voices as they made their plans. I could picture them, standing just beyond the trees, waiting for the right moment to strike. John stood by the door, the shotgun ready, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He was just as scared as I was, even if he didn't want to admit it. He had always been the strong one, the one who kept us safe, but now I could see the cracks forming. He didn't have a plan, and neither did I. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time didn't seem to exist in that cabin. All we could do was wait, listening to the sounds outside, praying that somehow they would leave us alone. But they didn't. They were patient, too patient. They knew we were trapped, and they were in no hurry. They had all night. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the back of the cabin. I jumped, my heart racing as I spun around to see what had happened. One of the windows had been smashed, glass littering the floor. They were coming in. John fired the shotgun, the sound deafening in the small cabin. There was a scream, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. He had hit someone. But it wasn't enough. I could hear Mark laughing again, his voice growing louder as he moved closer to the door. "You think that'll stop us?" he called out. "You're only making it worse for yourselves." We didn't have much time. They would come back, and when they did, they wouldn't stop until they got in. John grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the back of the cabin. "We need to go," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." "But where?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "They're everywhere." "We'll find a way," he said, his grip tightening on my arm. "We have to." We slipped out through the back window, the one they hadn't smashed yet, and ran into the woods. The cold air bit at my skin, and the darkness swallowed us whole as we stumbled over roots and rocks, trying to stay quiet. I could hear them behind us, their voices growing fainter as we moved deeper into the trees. We didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept running until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. Eventually, we found a road, an old dirt path that led back to the main highway. We were miles from the cabin, but we didn't stop. We kept walking, even as the sun started to rise, until we finally saw a car coming down the road. We flagged it down, and the driver, an older man, gave us a ride into town. We never went back to the cabin. We never even went back to get our things. Whatever we left behind wasn't worth the risk. We started over again, somewhere new, somewhere they couldn't find us. But I'll never forget that night. I was driving back from my brother's place out in the countryside. It wasn't too late, maybe around 11 p.m., but you know how it gets in those rural areas, pitch black, no streetlights, just your headlights cutting through the dark. The road was empty, and I was just focused on getting home. I had the radio on, low, just some talk show I wasn't really listening to. It was cold outside, and I was trying to keep the heat just right in the car, so the windows wouldn't fog up too much. Everything was fine, peaceful almost. The kind of drive that's quiet, and you zone out, thinking about random things. I didn't notice the car behind me at first. It wasn't until I hit a long stretch of straight road that I saw headlights in the rearview mirror. It wasn't close, just far back enough that I didn't really care. I remember thinking it was odd, though, because I hadn't seen anyone for miles. After a few minutes, the car was still behind me, but it had crept up closer. Maybe they were in a hurry, I figured. I stayed at the speed limit, thinking they'd pass me soon. But they didn't. I kept glancing in the mirror, expecting them to overtake, but they just hung back there, close enough now that I could tell it was some kind of sedan. No big deal, I thought. Maybe they were lost, too. Country roads all look the same at night. A few more miles went by, and they didn't pass. I started feeling uneasy. My hands were tight on the wheel, and I kept looking in the rear view, hoping they'd just turn off somewhere. I slowed down a bit, trying to give them the chance to pass, but instead, they slowed down with me, keeping the same distance. That's when I started to get nervous. I decided to pull off to the side, thinking maybe if I stopped, they'd just go around. There was a small shoulder on the road, enough for me to pull over. As soon as I slowed down and turned my blinker on, their headlights brightened, and they sped up, like they didn't want me to stop. It caught me off guard. I pulled over anyway, just to see what they would do. I thought maybe they were just being weird or in a hurry. But they didn't pass. The car slowed down and stopped right behind me. I sat there for a second, my heart pounding, thinking maybe they were just waiting for me to go. But then they didn't move. They just stayed there, headlights beaming into my rear window. It was too dark to see the driver, but I could feel them watching me. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if I should get out or just drive away. But every part of me was screaming not to get out of the car. So I didn't. I put the car in drive again and pulled back onto the road. They followed. I drove for a few miles like that, speeding up a little, thinking maybe I could lose them, but they stayed right behind me, matching my speed. No matter how fast or slow I went, they were there, keeping the same distance. By now, my hands were slick with sweat, and my chest felt tight. I tried to think of what to do. There weren't many turn-offs on that road, but I knew there was a gas station about 20 miles up, the only thing open this late. If I could make it there, maybe I could lose them, or at least be around other people. So I kept driving, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping me alive. A couple of minutes later, I saw it turn off a narrow dirt road that led into some woods. I knew it wasn't the way to the gas station, but I figured I could try to lose them by turning onto it. I slowed down just a bit, enough to make the turn without giving them too much time to react. As soon as I made the turn, their headlights followed, speeding up. My heart jumped into my throat. I floored it, the car bouncing and shaking on the uneven dirt road. The trees on either side made it feel like I was driving into a tunnel, with no way out. The car behind me was right there, their headlights flashing every time we hit a bump, like they were trying to make me crash. I tried to keep control, but the road was too rough. Every jolt made it harder to stay focused. The car behind me got closer, so close that I could feel the heat from their headlights through my back window. Then, out of nowhere, they rammed into me. It wasn't hard enough to push me off the road, but it was enough to send my heart into overdrive. I slammed on the gas, but they hit me again, harder this time. My car fishtailed, and I nearly lost control. The road up ahead started to curve, and I knew I had to slow down, but if I did, they'd hit me again, and I didn't think I could keep the car on the road much longer. I was trapped. I couldn't turn back, and I couldn't keep going like this. I saw a small clearing on the side of the road, just big enough to pull off. Without thinking, I veered off the road and into the clearing, hoping the trees would give me some cover. I turned off the headlights, hoping they wouldn't see me. I sat there, holding my breath, watching the road through the gaps in the trees. The car flew by, their headlights flashing for a second before disappearing around the bend. I waited, listening to the sound of the engine fading into the distance. I didn't move for what felt like hours, afraid they might come back. Eventually, I started the car again, my hands still shaking. I pulled back onto the road, keeping my lights off until I was sure they were gone. I drove the rest of the way to the gas station, checking the mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see their headlights coming up behind me again. But they didn't. When I finally pulled into the gas station, I didn't stop. I kept driving until I was back on the highway, heading home. I didn't care how late it was or how tired I felt. I just wanted to get as far away from that road as possible. I never found out who they were or what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure, they weren't just messing around. I don't know why I thought camping alone would be a good idea. I'd done it a few times before, nothing serious, just short trips to get away from everything. I liked the quiet. The sounds of the woods always calmed me down, helped me clear my head. This trip was supposed to be the same. A couple of days out by myself, no distractions, just me and the trees. The first night was fine. I hiked in, set up my tent near a small stream, and made myself some dinner. Nothing fancy, just a couple of sausages I'd brought with me and some instant coffee. The woods were peaceful, the sky was clear, and the stars were bright. I went to bed early, tired from the day of hiking, and slept straight through until morning. The second day was more of the same. I spent most of it exploring the area around my camp, nothing too far, just in case. I didn't see another person the whole time. It was like I had the entire forest to myself, and for a while, I enjoyed it. I didn't think anything was wrong. Everything felt normal. That night, though, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. It was the middle of the night, and my fire had burned down to just embers. The only light was from the half-moon overhead, and it barely cut through the trees. I lay there for a moment, listening. That's when I heard it, someone moving outside my tent. I froze. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hadn't seen anyone all day. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. There was a man sitting by my fire. He was crouched there, poking at the coals with a stick. He wasn't looking at me, not yet. His back was to me, and I could see he was eating something. I blinked a couple of times, trying to figure out if I was still dreaming, but no, he was real. He had a beard, messy, and his clothes looked dirty, like he'd been out here for a while. He was eating something out of one of my pans, something I didn't make. My mind was racing. I hadn't heard anyone approach. How long had he been there? I had no idea what to do. I didn't have anything for protection, no weapon, just a small pocket knife buried somewhere in my backpack. I tried to stay quiet, hoping he would finish whatever he was doing and leave. Then he spoke. "I hope you don't mind," he said, his voice low and rough. "I was hungry. Got lost out here. Been walking 4 hours." I didn't respond at first. I didn't trust my voice. After a few seconds, though, I realized I had to say something. If I didn't, it might make things worse. It's okay," I managed to say, my throat dry. You need help or something?" He finally turned around, and that's when I saw his eyes. They were too wide, too intense. Something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Nah, I'm good. Just need to rest a bit. It's quiet out here, ain't it?" He stared at me, not blinking, as if he was waiting for something. "Yeah," I said, forcing myself to sound calm, "it's quiet." He stood up then, stretching like he'd been sitting for hours. I saw he was taller than I thought, a lot bigger too. He took a step closer to my tent, and I could feel the tension rising in the air. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but where would I go? I was in the middle of the woods, miles from the nearest road. "So," he said, tilting his head, "you out here by yourself?" I hesitated. I didn't want to lie, but telling him I was alone felt like a mistake. "No," I lied, "I'm meeting some friends tomorrow. They're camping nearby." He smiled again, that same empty smile, and nodded. "Is that right?" he said, not sounding convinced. He looked around the campsite, like he was checking to see if I was telling the truth. For a while, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking at me, like he was trying to decide what to do next. I felt trapped, completely at his mercy. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out. Should I scream? Try to run? What if he had a weapon? After what felt like forever, he finally stepped back toward the fire. "Guess I'll just hang around for a bit," he said, sitting down again. "Been walking all night, like I said. Feels good to sit for a while." I didn't know what to say. I wanted him to leave, but I didn't want to provoke him. So I stayed quiet, watching him from inside my tent. He kept poking at the fire, eating my food, like he belonged there. After a few minutes, he started asking more questions. "You from around here?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was something in his tone that put me on edge. "No," I answered, keeping it short, hoping he wouldn't push further. "Figured," he said, nodding. "Ain't many folks come out this way. Place is pretty isolated. Easy to get lost." He kept talking, asking questions that felt more personal each time. How long I'd been camping, what I did for work, where I was headed next. I tried to give vague answers, but he wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. "You married?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine. "Got a boyfriend?" I hesitated again, my stomach twisting. "Yeah," I lied again. "He's meeting me tomorrow." He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me, that smile fading a little. "You don't gotta lie, you know," he said, his voice low, almost threatening. "Ain't no shame in being out here by yourself." My heart was racing now. I didn't know what he wanted, but it wasn't just food or a place to rest. The way he was watching me, the way he asked those questions, it felt like he was testing me, trying to see how much he could get away with. I started to panic, thinking of ways to get out of there. I thought about grabbing my stuff and running, but I didn't know if I'd make it far enough. I thought about trying to scare him off, but what if he called my bluff? The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. The man stayed by the fire, still talking, still watching me. I didn't feel safe. I knew I wasn't safe. I started making a plan in my head, rehearsing it over and over. I'd tell him I needed to get something from the car. It wasn't far, just a couple of minutes walk from the campsite. Once I got there, I'd lock myself inside and drive away as fast as I could. Finally, I worked up the courage to speak. "I need to grab something from my car," I said, trying to sound casual, like I wasn't planning anything. He looked at me for a long time, too long, and I thought for sure he'd stop me. But then he nodded. "All right," he said, "I'll wait here." I didn't waste any time. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, trying to move slowly, like I wasn't in a hurry. My legs felt shaky, but I forced myself to walk toward the car. I could feel his eyes on me the whole time, and every step felt like it was taking too long. When I finally reached the car, I didn't look back. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and unlocked the door. I got in, locked it, and started the engine. The sound of the engine felt deafening in the quiet of the woods. I looked back toward the campsite, and the man was standing now, just staring at me from across the clearing. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching as I backed the car up and drove away. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway, my heart still pounding. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know I was lucky to get out of there. I had been looking forward to this hike for weeks. I was always drawn to the mountains. The fresh air, the stunning views, the feeling of being away from everything. This time, I chose a remote mountain range, far from the usual crowds. The trail started off well, the sun shining bright, and I felt confident as I made my way up. I knew the risks of hiking in winter, but I was prepared. Or at least I thought I was. The first few hours were perfect. I took breaks to appreciate the views and took pictures of the snowy landscape. As I climbed higher, the air grew colder, and the wind began to pick up. It was around noon when the clouds rolled in. I figured I had plenty of time to get back down before anything serious happened. Then, the snow began to fall. At first, it was light, just flurries dancing around me. But in no time, it became a full-blown snowstorm. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I quickly lost sight of the trail. My heart sank as I realized how easy it would be to get lost in this weather. I thought about turning back, but I couldn't see the path. I had to keep moving. After a while, I stumbled upon a cabin. It was old and looked like it hadn't been used in years. The roof sagged under the weight of the snow, and the windows were dark. I hesitated, knowing it might not be safe, but I had no choice. The storm was getting worse, and I needed shelter. I pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly. The inside was cold and dark, but at least I was out of the wind. I took a moment to gather myself. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. There was no electricity, and the only light came from the small window covered in frost. The place smelled of mildew and decay. A thick layer of dust covered the furniture, and there were signs that someone had been there recently. An empty beer can lay on the floor, and a half-burned candle sat on the table. I decided to light the candle. The flickering flame cast eerie shadows around the room. I looked around, hoping to find something useful, maybe an old blanket or firewood. The small kitchen had a wood stove, but it was empty. The thought of having to stay here overnight began to sink in, and panic fluttered in my chest. I looked outside, but the storm was still raging. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. I rummaged through the cabinets, hoping to find anything useful, but they were mostly bare. Just some old dishes and rusted utensils. I kept looking, but nothing gave me hope. The wind howled outside, and I could hear the snow piling up against the door. As the hours passed, I grew more anxious. I wrapped my jacket around me for warmth and sat down at the table. The candle flickered, and I kept glancing toward the door, half expecting someone to come through. I tried to push the thoughts away, reminding myself that I was safe here, but the unease lingered. Just as night fell, I heard a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was a knock. It was faint, almost hesitant. My heart dropped. I didn't want to move, but the knocking continued. It came again, more urgent this time. Someone was out there. I grabbed my pocket knife, not knowing what I would do with it. I held my breath and waited. The knock came again, louder. I felt a rush of fear as I debated whether to open the door. What if it was someone in trouble? Or worse, what if it was someone dangerous? Finally, I heard a voice. Hello? Is anyone in there? It was a deep voice, and I could hear the urgency in it. I saw the light. Please, I need help. I hesitated, weighing my options. Should I open the door? What if this person meant me harm? But I couldn't just leave someone out there in a storm. I took a moment to steady my nerves and made my decision. I slowly opened the door, just a crack. The man standing there looked rough. His clothes were soaked and his face was pale. He appeared older than me, maybe in his 40s. Please, he said, I got caught in the storm. I thought this cabin was abandoned. Can I come in? Who are you? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm just a hiker. I got lost, he replied. I swear I won't hurt you. I just need a place to stay until the storm passes. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about him didn't sit right with me, but I could see he was genuinely cold and scared. I opened the door wider, letting him in. Thank you, he said, stepping inside. The warmth of the candle flickered in the dim light. He shook off the snow from his clothes, leaving a wet patch on the floor. I backed away slightly, unsure how to act. He glanced around the cabin, taking in the sparse surroundings. Looks like we are stuck here together, he said, trying to sound lighthearted. But there was an edge to his voice that made my stomach turn. I thought this place was abandoned, I replied, trying to keep the conversation going to understand his intentions. What were you doing out here? I was just out hiking. Didn't think the weather would turn so bad. He moved closer to the table, glancing at the candle. You're lucky to have found this place. It's better than being out in that storm. Yeah, I said, my voice trembling. I just want to stay safe. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, we all just want to be safe. He paused, his gaze lingering on me. Do you have any food? I didn't bring much with me. I have some granola bars, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a few bars. He took them eagerly, almost too eagerly. As he ate, I kept my distance, watching him. There was something unsettling about the way he was looking at me, like he was assessing me. The more he ate, the more I felt my anxiety rising. I glanced at the door, thinking about escaping, but I knew the storm would make it impossible. So, what are you doing out here alone? He asked, wiping his mouth. I needed a break, I said, my voice shaking. Just wanted some time to myself. He nodded, but his eyes narrowed. You know, this place isn't as safe as it seems. People can get lost out here. Sometimes, you meet the wrong kind of people. I felt a chill run through me. I don't plan on staying long, I said, trying to sound firm. He smiled again, but there was a darkness behind it. That's good. You never know what can happen in a storm like this. The wind howled outside, and I felt trapped. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls closing in. I needed to find a way out, but I didn't want to make any sudden moves. I started thinking about my options. I should check on the weather, I said, trying to keep my tone calm. Maybe it will pass soon. There's no point in doing that, he said, shaking his head. The storm is just getting started. Best to stay put and wait it out. No sense in taking unnecessary risks. His tone sent alarms ringing in my head. Something about the way he said it felt wrong. I forced a smile, trying to keep him calm while I thought of an escape plan. As the minutes passed, the tension grew heavier. The man shifted closer to me, and I could see the light reflecting in his eyes. I knew I had to act fast. I need to use the bathroom, I said, trying to sound casual. Okay, he said, but make it quick. We don't want to get caught out there. I nodded and quickly moved toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I opened it just enough to slip outside, not bothering to turn back. I stepped into the freezing night, the snow swirling around me. I didn't look back at the cabin. I knew I had to run. I sprinted into the woods, the cold biting at my skin. I didn't stop to think, just ran as fast as I could through the snow, my breath coming in quick gasps. I could hear him calling after me, but I didn't stop. I kept pushing through the trees, hoping to find my way back to the trail. The wind howled, and I stumbled more than once, but I forced myself to keep going. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I broke through the trees and found the main trail. I turned to look back, but I didn't see him. I could still hear the storm raging, but I was on the path now. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I fumbled with my keys, almost dropping them in the snow. When I finally got the door open, I jumped in and locked it behind me. I started the engine and didn't look back as I drove away, my heart still racing. That night, as I drove through the storm, I realized how close I had come to something terrible. I didn't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I was grateful to have made it out. The mountains had their beauty, but they also had darkness. And I learned that sometimes, the real danger lies in the shadows. I had never been one to pick up hitchhikers. There was something about the idea of letting a stranger into my car that always felt wrong. But on that lonely stretch of highway, in the middle of nowhere, I found myself considering it. It was late afternoon when I first spotted him. He stood by the side of the road, backpack slung over one shoulder, looking like he had been there for hours. I slowed my car down, feeling a mix of curiosity and concern. The sun was setting, and the thought of someone stranded out here alone didn't sit well with me. He smiled as I rolled down my window. "Hey there. Mind giving me a ride?" His voice was friendly, and there was something disarming about his easy smile. "Sure. Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to gauge his intentions. "Just a bit further down the road. I'm trying to get to the next town." He opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. As he settled in, I noticed his clothes were dirty, and his eyes had a wild look to them. But I brushed it off. Everyone has their story. I drove off, and he began chatting right away. "I appreciate this. I've been stuck out here for a while. It's a bit of a trek to the next place." His tone was light, and I could tell he was trying to make small talk. "No problem," I replied, keeping my eyes on the road. The landscape around us was barren, nothing but fields stretching endlessly on both sides. "Do you live around here?" he asked. "I'm just passing through. Visiting some family," I said. He nodded, looking thoughtful for a moment. "Family is important." "I had a family once," he said, his voice dropping. "But things got complicated." I glanced at him. "Complicated how?" He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You wouldn't believe it. I used to have a normal life. A good job. A nice house. But then, I don't know. Things fell apart." He looked out the window, his expression darkening. "People can be so cruel. You think you know them, and then they surprise you." "Yeah, I guess so," I replied cautiously. "People can change." He nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed outside. "You're right. Sometimes they reveal their true selves when you least expect it." The way he said that sent a shiver down my spine. I shifted in my seat, trying to focus on the road ahead. "So, what were you doing out here?" I asked, hoping to steer the conversation back to lighter topics. "I was just looking for a fresh start. You know how it is. Sometimes you need to run away from the past." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made me uneasy. "Running away from what?" I asked, unable to hold back my curiosity. He turned to look at me, his eyes intense. "From people who want to hurt me. People I trusted." There was a tightness in his voice, and I could sense he was holding back more than he was saying. I decided to change the subject. "How long have you been out here?" "Long enough," he replied. "I've been sleeping in my car, moving from one place to another. You meet a lot of interesting folks out here. But you also meet dangerous ones." A knot formed in my stomach. I could feel the tension rising. "Have you had any bad experiences?" "Oh, plenty," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "I once picked up a guy who seemed harmless. But then he turned on me. Tried to rob me. It's always the ones who seem friendly that you have to watch out for." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, suddenly hyper-aware of the way he was looking at me. "That sounds terrifying." "It was," he said, leaning closer, his voice low. "You never know who you can trust. That's why I don't let anyone in anymore. I keep my distance. It's safer that way." "Right," I said, forcing a smile. "You have to be careful." "Yeah," he said, glancing out the window again. "But it's not just strangers you have to worry about. Sometimes, it's the people closest to you. They'll betray you when you least expect it." I felt a chill creep up my spine. The way he spoke, the intensity in his voice, it was unnerving. I tried to change the topic again. "So, what do you plan to do when you get to the next town?" "Maybe find a job. Settle down for a bit. Just need to keep my head down," he replied, but there was an underlying tension in his words. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "That sounds good. Everyone deserves a second chance." He turned to me, and for a moment, I saw something flash in his eyes, a hint of desperation mixed with anger. "You know, it's hard to have a second chance when people won't let you forget your past. They look at you and see your mistakes." The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, and I felt trapped. "Well, sometimes you just have to prove them wrong," I said, trying to be encouraging. "Right. But sometimes they won't let you," he said, his voice dropping again. "And that's when things get messy." I stole a glance at him. "What do you mean?" He leaned back in his seat, his demeanor shifting. "Let's just say there are people who are not going to let me go easily. I've had to run from them before." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes it's better to keep moving." "But I think they might have found me," he said, a smile creeping onto his face that felt more like a grimace. "Who?" I asked, my heart racing. "People who don't like loose ends. People who want what they lost." "Are you in trouble?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. He turned his head sharply, his eyes locked onto mine. "What do you think?" I felt a wave of fear wash over me. The road seemed to close in, the trees becoming shadows along the edges. "I think you need to get out of the car," I said, my voice firm. He chuckled again, but there was no warmth to it. "You think you can just drop me off and be done with it? It doesn't work like that." I felt the adrenaline kick in. "I mean it. You need to get out." He leaned closer, his face inches from mine. "And what if I don't? What if I don't want to?" My heart raced as I realized how serious this had become. I will call the police, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Do you think they can help you? I can tell you stories about cops and how they can't protect you. They don't care. Panic bubbled inside me. I needed to get away from him. I am not afraid of you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Good. You shouldn't be. You should be afraid of the people who are really out there. He laughed softly, but there was nothing funny about it. Just pull over, I said, my voice strained. He sighed but then leaned back, a semblance of calm returning. Fine, I will get out. But you have to promise me something. What? I asked, dreading the answer. Promise me you will keep your eyes open. Because they are everywhere. I didn't respond. I just kept driving, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. The tension in the car felt unbearable. I had to find a way to get rid of him. I spotted a small diner up ahead, its light shining bright against the darkening sky. Let's stop there. You can grab something to eat, and I will be on my way. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. Fine. I could use something warm. I pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine. Let's make this quick, I said, trying to sound composed. He opened the door and stepped out, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I waited a moment before following him, my heart pounding as I approached the diner's entrance. As we walked inside, I could see the diner was almost empty. A few patrons were scattered at the booths, and a waitress glanced up at us. I could feel the man's presence beside me. His energy was unsettling. Grab a seat, I said, trying to act casual. I'll be right back. I headed to the bathroom, hoping to gather my thoughts. I locked the door behind me and took a few deep breaths, my heart racing. I had to find a way to get out of this situation. When I stepped back into the diner, I saw him sitting at the counter, chatting with the waitress. He looked completely at ease, but I felt anything but. I glanced around, looking for an exit. The waitress was laughing at something he said, and I could see him glancing around the room, assessing everyone. I made my way toward him, trying to act natural. What do you want to eat? I asked. Just some coffee and a sandwich, he replied, still smiling at the waitress. I forced a smile. That sounds good. As the waitress walked away, I leaned closer to him. I think it's best if you get going. I do not want to be involved in this. He turned to me, his eyes narrowing. You think you can just push me away like that? You brought me here. I am just trying to help you. I am not in this with you. I do not want to get involved, I said, my voice trembling slightly. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. You think you can just drop me and leave? You have no idea what you are getting into. Suddenly, I heard the door swing open, and a chill ran down my spine. Two men walked in, their eyes scanning the diner, looking for someone. My breath caught in my throat. The man next to me smiled. Looks like they found me after all. My heart raced as I realized I needed to act fast. Listen, you need to get out of here. Now. He shook his head slowly. No, I think it is too late for that. Before I could respond, one of the men approached us. There you are, he said, a grin spreading across his face. I turned to the man next to me, panic rising. You need to leave. He smiled at me, but there was nothing friendly about it. Don't worry. I will take care of this. The tension in the diner thickened as the second man joined them. We have been looking for you, he said, his voice low and menacing. The man next to me stood up, a strange calm washing over him. I know, but I think I will stay a little longer. Before I could react, he turned to the men. "You can't have me. I am done running." I felt my heart racing as I realized I needed to escape. I quickly stepped back, looking for a way out. The diner felt like a trap, and I was the prey. "Hey," one of the men shouted, grabbing my arm. "Where do you think you are going?" I yanked my arm free, my instincts kicking in. I dashed toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I burst through the door, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I ran toward my car. I fumbled for my keys, trembling as I tried to unlock the door. I could hear footsteps behind me, growing closer. Just as I managed to open the door, I jumped inside and locked it. My hands shook as I started the engine, glancing in the rearview mirror. The man from the diner stood outside, a look of rage on his face as he shouted something I could not hear. I slammed the car into reverse, backing out of the parking lot as fast as I could. I didn't look back, my heart racing as I drove away from the diner and into the dark night. With every mile, I could feel the tension easing, but I knew I had narrowly escaped something terrible. I kept my eyes on the road, thankful to be alive. Sometimes, trust is a dangerous thing. I learned that the hard way. I had been driving for hours, navigating the winding country roads while the rain fell in relentless sheets. It was supposed to be a quick trip to visit an old friend. The skies darkened, and the wind whipped through the trees like a chorus of warnings. I should have turned back, but I pressed on, convinced I could make it. Suddenly, the car hit a slick patch of road. My heart raced as I lost control. The vehicle spun, tires screeching, and I felt a sickening lurch as I crashed into a ditch. The airbag deployed, slamming into my face with a force that left me disoriented. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding, rain pouring in through the broken window. I pushed the airbag away and took stock of the situation. The car was damaged, steam rising from the hood, and I knew I couldn't stay here. I stepped out into the downpour, the cold rain soaking through my clothes instantly. I stumbled away from the car, desperate for help. In the distance, I saw a light flickering through the rain. I made my way toward it, praying that someone would be home. My shoes squelched in the mud as I approached a small farmhouse. I knocked on the door, my knuckles aching from the cold. A moment later, the door swung open. A tall man with a weathered face stood there, his eyes narrowing as he took me in. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "I crashed my car," I explained, shivering. "Could I use your phone?" He frowned, glancing back over his shoulder as if weighing his options. "You can come in, but the phone is in the basement. My wife is sick. I don't want her disturbed." I nodded, grateful for any refuge. He stepped aside, allowing me to enter. The farmhouse smelled of damp wood and something earthy. "I'm Charlie," he said, closing the door behind us. "Thank you." "Stay here," he interrupted, leading me toward a steep staircase that descended into darkness. "Why the basement?" I asked, a flicker of unease creeping in. "It's quieter down there." "You'll be safe," he replied, his tone firm. Against my better judgment, I followed him down the stairs, each step echoing in the confined space. When we reached the bottom, he flicked on a bare bulb that swung from the ceiling. The light flickered, casting eerie shadows against the damp walls. "Have a seat," he said, pointing to an old wooden chair. I hesitated but sat down, my instinct screaming at me. "I'll get you some dry clothes and then call for help," he said, turning away. "Thank you," I said, but he didn't respond. The air in the basement felt heavy, and I could hear the rain pounding above. After a few moments, Charlie returned with a blanket, tossing it over my shoulders. "You might be here a while." "The storm is bad," he said. I nodded, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. "How long do you think?" "Could be a few hours," he said, crossing his arms. "Could I use the phone now?" I asked, shifting in my seat. Charlie's expression changed. "We'll do it later," he said, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. I sat in silence, watching him pace, his expression growing more intense. "What's wrong?" I finally asked, my voice shaky. "Nothing," he replied, but there was a strange gleam in his eyes. "Is there someone else here?" I asked, looking around the dim space. He chuckled softly. "Just me and you. You're safe here." I shifted in the chair, the blanket slipping off my shoulders. "I should really call my friend. He'll be worried." Charlie's demeanor changed, his smile fading. "You don't need to worry about that." I stood up, adrenaline surging through me. "I need to go. This isn't right." He stepped closer, blocking my path. "You don't want to leave. It's dangerous out there." "I can't stay here," I said, fear creeping in. He smiled, but it was no longer friendly. "You're not going anywhere. I have plans for you." Panic surged through me. "What do you mean?" "Let me out of here," I shouted, my voice echoing against the walls. Charlie's expression darkened. "You think I'm just going to let you walk away? No one ever leaves." I stumbled back, my heart racing. "What are you talking about? You can't keep me here." "Don't you see?" he said, his voice low and intense. "You're in my world now. You crashed your car. You're mine." I backed away, searching for an escape. My eyes darted around the basement, looking for something, anything that could help me. "Please, I just want to leave." He moved closer, the light swinging overhead, casting ominous shadows. "You'll stay here until I say you can go." Desperation fueled my actions. I spotted a small window at the top of the stairs, barely big enough to squeeze through, but it was my only chance. I bolted toward the stairs, adrenaline coursing through me. "Get back here," he shouted, his voice booming as he lunged forward. I scrambled up the steps, heart pounding in my ears. I reached the top and pushed against the door, but it was locked. "Open the door!" I yelled, my panic rising. I heard him behind me, his footsteps heavy as he climbed the stairs. I threw my weight against the door, slamming my shoulder into it again and again, feeling it start to give. Just as I heard him reach the top step, the door burst open, and I stumbled into the kitchen, the chaos of the moment blurring my thoughts. I sprinted toward the front door, praying it would be unlocked. "Stop!" Charlie yelled, but I didn't listen. I yanked the door open, my breath catching as I stepped out into the rain. I ran across the yard, slipping on the muddy ground, hearing him behind me, but I didn't look back. I spotted my car, just a few yards away, and my heart leapt at the sight. I fumbled with my keys, fingers trembling as I tried to unlock the door. The rain poured down, soaking me to the bone, but I didn't care. I needed to get away. "Get back here," he shouted, his voice filled with rage. I finally got the door open and jumped inside, locking it as quickly as I could. I turned the key in the ignition, praying it would start. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the gear into drive. I sped away from the farmhouse, my heart racing as I glanced in the rearview mirror. Charlie stood there, a dark figure in the rain, watching me leave. The road stretched out before me, the storm still raging, but I felt a surge of relief wash over me. I had escaped. I didn't know what had just happened or what his plans had been, but I was free. As I drove away, I vowed never to take a detour through those back roads again. I had seen the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of a friendly face, and I would never forget it. I had been looking forward to that trip for weeks. I had found the lake online, some random fishing forum, tucked away deep in the woods. It wasn't too far from where I lived, just a couple hours' drive, but it was remote enough that it didn't seem like many people knew about it. That was the appeal. A day of solitude, just me, the water, and maybe some bass if I was lucky. The morning was perfect for it. The sky was overcast, which kept the sun from beating down on me, and the air had that cool, early autumn bite to it. I loaded up my gear, grabbed a sandwich from the cooler, and started paddling out into the lake. The water was still, calm, reflecting the dull gray of the clouds. It was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I couldn't hear a single sound of civilization, no cars, no voices, nothing. Just nature. I rowed out to the middle of the lake and cast my line. I could tell right away it was going to be a slow day. I didn't mind though. Fishing was as much about the peace as it was about the catch. I was in no hurry. I settled into the boat, cracked open a beer, and let the hours drift by. It was sometime in the afternoon when I noticed it movement far off in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a big lake, and maybe someone else had the same idea as me. But as the boat got closer, something about it felt off. It was moving slow, creeping through the water like whoever was rowing didn't care about being in a hurry. I squinted to get a better look. It wasn't the type of boat you'd expect to see for fishing. It was smaller, more like a dinghy, and there were two figures in it. I tried to ignore it at first. There was no reason to be worried, right? I wasn't the only person in the world who liked a quiet lake. But the way they were coming toward me, slow and deliberate, it started to put me on edge. My gut told me something wasn't right. Still, I tried to brush it off. They could just be out for a paddle. Maybe they were friendly. But they weren't fishing. They didn't have rods, no gear, nothing. As they got closer, I could see their faces, two men, both wearing dark clothes, no life jackets, no coolers, nothing that suggested they were out there for the same reason I was. Just them in the boat, heading straight for me. I stopped pretending I wasn't nervous. I started reeling in my line, trying to act casual, but my mind was racing. The boat was less than 50 yards away now, and they weren't slowing down. I gave them a little wave, thinking maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they were just out here to enjoy the lake like me. But they didn't wave back. They didn't say anything. They just kept coming, eyes locked on me. Panic started to creep in. My boat was a small rowboat, not exactly made for speed, and I was right in the middle of the lake. If I tried to paddle away, they'd catch up to me in no time. I could feel my heart start to pound, and my hands were shaking as I tried to think of what to do. They were almost on top of me now, maybe 20 feet away, and one of them finally spoke. "Hey, you alone out here?" His voice was flat, emotionless, like he already knew the answer. "Yeah," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just out fishing. What about you guys?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the other guy in the boat, and they both smiled just a little, like they were sharing some private joke. That smile sent a chill down my spine. "We've been looking for a spot like this," the first guy said, still watching me. pretty secluded, huh? I nodded, my throat tightening. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but I didn't know what. Run? Fight? I was stuck out here in the middle of the lake with nowhere to go. I forced myself to stay calm, to not show how scared I was. What do you want? I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out shaky. The second guy, who hadn't said anything yet, finally spoke up. We're just looking to have a little fun, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. He was grinning now, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of grin you see on someone who enjoys making other people uncomfortable. I could feel the sweat on my forehead, despite the cool air. I looked around, but there was no one else. No other boats, no people on the shore. Just me, them, and the empty lake. Listen, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I don't want any trouble. I'm just out here to fish. The first guy shrugged. No trouble at all. We're just going to tie your boat to ours, have a little chat. What do you think? I didn't have to think. I knew if they got close enough to tie my boat to theirs, I was done for. I didn't know what they had planned, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I'm actually about to head back, I said, grabbing my oars and starting to row, trying to make it look casual, like I wasn't panicking. But as soon as I moved, they moved too faster now, closing the gap between us in seconds. I didn't wait. I started rowing as hard as I could, my arms burning as I pulled the oars through the water. The boat rocked with the effort, and I could hear the splash of their oars behind me, getting louder. Hey, the first guy shouted, his voice sharp now, all pretense of friendliness gone. Where do you think you're going? I didn't answer. I just kept rowing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My boat was small, light, but I wasn't sure I could outrun them. They were stronger, faster, and I could hear them gaining on me. The shore felt impossibly far away. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them closing in, their faces hard, determined. I wasn't going to make it. And then I saw it, a narrow inlet off to the side, hidden by trees and reeds. It wasn't much, but it was my only shot. I veered the boat hard to the left, aiming for the inlet, hoping the trees would give me some cover. The boat lurched as I hit the shallow water, the oars scraping against the muddy bottom. I jumped out, my feet sinking into the cold water, and dragged the boat into the reeds as fast as I could. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in sharp, painful bursts, but I didn't stop. I crouched down in the reeds, my body trembling, trying to stay as still as possible. I could hear them now, just a few feet away, their boat sliding through the water. Where'd he go? One of them muttered, his voice angry, frustrated. I don't know, the other replied, his voice tight with irritation. He couldn't have gotten far. I stayed silent, barely breathing, listening as they rowed past, their eyes scanning the shoreline. I could see them through the gaps in the reeds, their faces twisted in anger, their hands clenched tightly around the oars. They circled the area for what felt like hours, but eventually they gave up. I watched as they rowed back out into the open water, their voices fading as they disappeared into the distance. I didn't move for a long time, afraid they might come back. My legs were cramped, my muscles aching, but I didn't care. I was alive. I had made it. When I was sure they were gone, I climbed back into my boat and rowed as fast as I could back to shore. The sun was starting to set, the sky turning dark, and I didn't stop until I reached my car. I packed up my gear in record time, my hands shaking, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. I didn't care about the fish. I didn't care about the lake. All I cared about was getting out of there. I haven't been back since. I don't think I ever will. We were just looking for something different to do that weekend, something out of the ordinary. It was me, Sarah, Jake, and Ben. We'd been on road trips before, hitting ghost towns and weird spots we'd heard about online, but this place was different. It was an old mining town, abandoned for decades, way out in the desert. It wasn't one of those tourist spots with signs and plaques, just a place we'd found on some blog. Most people didn't go there because it was too out of the way. We drove for hours down dirt roads, barely seeing another car, until we finally got there. The town was small, mostly crumbling buildings and a few mine entrances scattered around the hills. It was hot, even though it wasn't summer yet, and there was no wind, just that dead, dry air that makes everything feel still. It looked like no one had been there for a long time. We parked the car on the edge of town and started exploring. It was mostly what you'd expect: empty houses, broken windows, old signs falling apart. There was a saloon with half the roof caved in, a general store with shelves still standing but covered in dust, and a couple of rusty old cars sitting in what used to be a street. Everything was quiet except for the crunch of our footsteps on the dirt. After about an hour, we came across the mine entrance. It was a huge black hole in the side of the hill, with old wooden beams holding up the mouth. A rusty sign was nailed to one of the beams, barely readable, something about it being dangerous and off limits. That didn't stop us, though. We'd come all this way, and we weren't about to turn back just because of some old sign. Jake was the first one to suggest we go inside, of course. He always had to push things further than anyone else. Sarah wasn't so sure, but Ben and I didn't need much convincing. I mean, we had flashlights and figured we'd stick close together. How bad could it be? We decided to split up once we got inside, each of us taking a different tunnel, just to cover more ground. Looking back, that was the first mistake. The air inside was cool compared to the desert heat, but it smelled stale, like dirt and something metallic. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, and the walls were rough, jagged rock, carved out by miners who had been long gone. I went down one of the tunnels on my own, promising to meet back with everyone in half an hour. At first, it was kind of exciting, walking through the dark, feeling like I was discovering something hidden. But as I got deeper, the tunnel narrowed, and the light from the entrance disappeared completely. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional drip of water somewhere. I started to feel uneasy, like I wasn't supposed to be there. But I kept going. I came across an old mining cart, tipped over on its side, with broken tracks running along the floor. I took a few pictures with my phone and kept moving, my flashlight bouncing off the walls. Then I heard something. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, a creak, like wood bending under weight. I stopped, shining my light around, but there was nothing. Just the rocks in the cart and the emptiness. I told myself it was probably just the old beams settling, but the sound made my skin crawl. I started to head back, figuring I'd seen enough. That's when I noticed something strange. The tunnel didn't look the same. I'd only taken one turn, I was sure of it, but now it felt like I was deeper in than I should have been. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. I tried not to panic, telling myself it was just my imagination. Then I heard it again, the creaking sound, but this time it was closer. My flashlight flickered, and for a second, I was in complete darkness. I smacked the side of it, and the light came back on, but my hands were shaking. I needed to get out of there. I picked up my pace, trying to find the turn I'd missed, but the tunnel kept going, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. It was like the walls were shifting around me. I couldn't hear anyone else, and I realized I had no idea how far I'd gone. I should have turned back earlier. I started shouting for the others, my voice echoing off the stone, but there was no answer. I kept walking, but the feeling of being watched was growing stronger. Every now and then, I'd shine my light over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. But there was nothing. Just darkness. Finally, I saw what looked like the tunnel entrance up ahead. I breathed a sigh of relief and hurried toward it, but when I got closer, I realized it wasn't the entrance at all. It was a wooden door, old and weathered, with rusted hinges. I hadn't seen any doors when I came in. I don't know why I didn't just turn around then and there, but I felt like I had to see what was behind it. Maybe it was some old storage room, something left behind by the miners. I reached for the handle, but the door creaked open on its own before I could touch it. It swung inward, slow and heavy, revealing a small room carved out of the rock. Inside, there were shelves lining the walls, and on the shelves were old tools, pickaxes, hammers, shovels. But that wasn't what made my stomach drop. It was the smell. It hit me all at once, a rancid stench like rotting meat and something sour, something wrong. I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve, but the smell was everywhere. And then I saw it, an old wooden chair, sitting in the middle of the room, facing away from me. There were ropes tied to the arms and legs of the chair, frayed and stained with something dark. My flashlight flickered again, casting strange shadows on the walls, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone sitting in the chair. But when I blinked, the chair was empty. I backed out of the room, my heart racing. I needed to get out. I turned to leave, but just as I stepped back into the tunnel, I heard the door slam shut behind me with a loud, echoing bang. I whipped around, shining my light at the door, but it was just a door, closed now, like it had never opened at all. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in the mine. Someone had followed me in. Someone had closed the door. I ran. I didn't care which direction I was going anymore. I just needed to get out, to find the others. I could hear footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, like whoever was there wasn't in a hurry. They didn't need to be. They knew the mine better than I did. I tripped over something, maybe a rock, maybe my own feet, and hit the ground hard. My flashlight flew out of my hand and rolled away, the beam flickering. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the light, and kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. After what felt like forever, I saw light up ahead, real light, not the sickly yellow of my flashlight. I ran toward it, my legs burning, my lungs on fire. I burst out of the tunnel into the open air, the sun already setting behind the hills. I stumbled to the ground, gasping for breath. Sarah, Jake, and Ben were already outside, sitting by the car, laughing and talking like nothing had happened. They hadn't even noticed I was missing. When I told them what happened, they didn't believe me. They thought I was just messing with them, trying to scare them. But I know what I saw. I know someone was in there with me, someone who didn't want me to leave. We left the town that night, and I haven't gone back since. I don't think I ever will. I don't usually drive at night, but I had no choice that time. My phone died, and I couldn't find the charger, so I was stuck with an old map I had in the glove compartment. I had been driving for hours, just trying to get home after visiting a friend who lived out in the country. I didn't know the area well, and it felt like every road was leading nowhere. One wrong turn after another, and soon I realized I was lost. I kept driving down this narrow, winding road, hoping I'd see a sign or something familiar, but it was just trees on both sides, and the headlights barely cut through the darkness. It started raining, 2 heavy drops pounding against the windshield, making it even harder to see. My nerves were shot, and I just wanted to get out of there. But then I saw it, a large house, or maybe a farm, off to the side of the road. It looked abandoned at first. The grass was overgrown, the windows dark, and there were no cars parked outside. The driveway was long, disappearing into the shadows. But I was desperate. I figured someone might live there, or at least I could use their phone if the place wasn't completely empty. I pulled in and parked near the front, leaving my headlights on to light the way. The rain was coming down harder now, and I was already soaked by the time I got out of the car. The house was bigger than it looked from the road. 2 stories, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. I walked up to the front door and knocked, hoping someone would answer. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time, calling out, "Hello?" Still nothing. I tried the door. It creaked open. I hesitated, but I figured if the door wasn't locked, it couldn't hurt to step inside and see if anyone was home. The inside was just as run down as the outside. Dusty furniture, dim lighting, and an odd smell I couldn't place. The air felt heavy, and the house seemed way too quiet, like no one had been there in years. I walked into what looked like the living room, calling out again. "Hello? Anyone here?" That's when I heard it. A noise from upstairs. It sounded like something moving, maybe footsteps. I froze for a second, my heart racing, but then I thought, maybe it's just someone who didn't hear me come in. I decided to check it out, hoping I wasn't about to spook some old guy living alone. I climbed the stairs slowly, the wood creaking under my feet. At the top, there was a long hallway with several doors, all of them closed. I wasn't sure which way to go, so I just stood there for a moment, listening. That's when one of the doors opened. A man stepped out, tall and thin, with a long face and sunken eyes. He was wearing old clothes, like something out of a different time. His expression was blank, but his eyes locked on me immediately, like he knew I wasn't supposed to be there. "What are you doing in my house?" His voice was cold, flat. I stammered, trying to explain that I was lost, that I just needed help finding my way, maybe a phone. But he didn't seem to care. "You're trespassing," he said, taking a step toward me. I could feel my stomach drop. There was something off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to apologize, backing up a little, but he kept coming closer. "You need to leave," he said, his voice getting lower, more threatening. I turned to head back downstairs, but before I could take another step, I felt his hand grab my arm hard. I yanked it away, my heart pounding in my chest, but he was faster than I expected. He blocked my path, his eyes wild now. "You think you can just come into my house?" he snarled. "You think you can just walk in like you own the place?" I didn't know what to do. I was scared, more scared than I'd ever been in my life. I tried to talk my way out of it, telling him I'd leave, that I didn't mean any harm, but he wasn't listening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something, a knife. It wasn't big, but the sight of it sent me into a panic. "You're not going anywhere," he said, almost whispering now. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to figure out how to get out of there. He lunged at me, and I bolted, running down the hallway as fast as I could. I didn't even know where I was going, just away from him. I ducked into one of the rooms, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking, and I could hear him outside, banging on the door, shouting that I couldn't hide, that I wouldn't make it out. I looked around the room, trying to find another way out, but there was only a small window, barely big enough for me to squeeze through. The door started to crack under the force of his blows. I knew I didn't have much time. I ran to the window, forcing it open, the rain pouring in from outside. It was a tight fit, but I managed to push myself through, landing hard on the wet ground outside. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I just ran, slipping in the mud, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I made it to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine started, and I floored it, the tires spinning in the mud before finally catching. I sped down the driveway, my heart racing, the rain blurring everything outside the windshield. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, my mind still racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I found a gas station, parked under the bright lights, and just sat there for a while, shaking, trying to calm down. I didn't call the police. I didn't want to explain what I was doing out there or how I ended up in that situation. I just wanted to forget it, to get home and put it behind me. But I can't forget. Even now, I still think about that night, about how close I came to never making it out of there. And I'll never, ever go back down a road I don't know. Not ever again. I wasn't even planning to run that day. I'd been up late the night before, working on some stuff around the house, and I was tired. But the weather was perfect, and I told myself I'd just do a short jog, nothing too serious. I liked running on the back roads near my place, the ones that cut through the farmland. It's peaceful out there, barely any traffic, just fields and the occasional tractor. I didn't bring my phone. I know, it sounds stupid now, but I never used to. I liked the quiet and being disconnected. I had my route down 5 miles out and back, and I'd done it 100 times before. I was about 3 miles in when I saw the truck. It wasn't anything special, just an old, beat-up pickup. It was pulled off to the side of the road, facing me. I didn't think much of it at first, just kept my pace. As I got closer, I noticed the driver was still sitting inside, staring at me. That's when I started to feel uneasy, but I kept going. I didn't want to stop and look scared. People stop on these roads all the time, I told myself. I passed the truck, keeping my eyes straight ahead. Then I heard the engine start. The truck pulled onto the road behind me, slow at first, like he was following me. I tried to stay calm, told myself it was just a coincidence, but my heart was starting to race. I picked up my pace a little, my legs moving faster than I intended. I could hear the truck coming up behind me, and then, just like that, it pulled in front of me and stopped. The door swung open before I could react. A man stepped out. He was tall, heavy-set, and wearing a dirty baseball cap. His face was rough, like he hadn't shaved in days. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. I thought maybe he needed help, but something about his posture made me hesitate. He wasn't smiling, wasn't asking for directions. He just stood there, staring at me. Before I could turn around, he lunged at me. I barely had time to scream before his hands were on me, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the truck. I fought back, kicking and twisting, but he was strong. My mind went blank. All I could think about was getting away. I managed to wrench my arm free for a second and tried to run, but he was faster. He caught me by the waist and dragged me to the truck, throwing me inside the cab. I hit the seat hard, gasping for breath. He slammed the door and got in on the driver's side, locking the doors. I fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The truck was already moving. I was trapped. I tried to scream, but he hit me hard across the face. The pain was blinding, and my vision blurred. "Shut up," he growled, his voice low and cold. I clutched my cheek, my whole body shaking. I wanted to scream again, but I was too scared. We drove for what felt like forever, bouncing along the back roads. I had no idea where we were going. My head was spinning, my thoughts all jumbled. I kept thinking this couldn't be happening. Stuff like this doesn't happen in real life, not to people like me. But it was happening, and I had no control. The truck finally slowed down as we pulled off the main road onto a dirt path. There were no houses, no signs of life, just fields and trees. After a few minutes, I saw the barn. It was old, with peeling red paint and a sagging roof. There were no other buildings around, no animals, nothing. Just this barn in the middle of nowhere. He stopped the truck in front of it and got out, walking around to my side. I tried to brace myself, but I didn't stand a chance. He yanked the door open, grabbed me by the arm, and dragged me out. I stumbled, nearly falling, but he didn't care. He pulled me toward the barn, his grip like iron. I tried to resist, but my body wasn't working right. I was too terrified. He shoved me inside, slamming the door behind us. The air smelled musty, like dirt and rot. It was dark, but I could see enough to know there was no way out. The windows were boarded up, and there was nothing inside but some old tools and a stack of hay in the corner. He pushed me down onto the floor and pulled out some rope from his pocket. I tried to fight him off, but he was too strong. He tied my wrists behind my back, tight enough that I could feel the rope digging into my skin. Then he tied my ankles, leaving me lying there, helpless. "Don't move," he said, standing over me. His voice was calm now, almost casual. "I'll be back." I watched him walk out of the barn, closing the door behind him. The sound of the lock clicking echoed in my ears. I was alone. I lay there for a while, trying to catch my breath. My whole body ached, and my mind was racing. I couldn't believe this was happening. I thought about screaming, but who would hear me? We were miles from anywhere. No one was coming. I didn't know how long I lay there, but eventually, I heard the door open again. I tensed up, trying to prepare myself for whatever was coming next. But it wasn't the man. It was someone else. It was another man, younger, maybe in his 20s. He had a rough look about him, with dirty clothes and unkempt hair. He looked at me with a kind of casual indifference, like I was just another part of his day. "She's awake," he said, turning back toward the door. The first man walked in behind him. He nodded, looking me over. "Good. We need to get this done." The younger man walked over to the corner of the barn and pulled out a chair, setting it in front of me. The older man sat down, leaning forward. "Here's how this is going to go," he said. "You're going to do exactly what I tell you. If you don't, things are going to get bad. You understand?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too scared to even speak. He sighed and shook his head. "You're going to help me get some money," he continued. "We're going to call someone you know. Someone who'll pay to get you back. You got family, right?" I nodded, my heart racing. "Good," he said. "You're going to tell them exactly what I say, or I'm going to hurt you. You understand that?" I nodded again, tears welling up in my eyes. I didn't know what else to do. He pulled out a phone and dialed a number, holding it up to my ear. "Say what I tell you," he ordered. The phone rang, and after a few moments, someone picked up. It was my sister. I could hear her voice, but I couldn't speak. I was choking on my fear. "Tell her you need help," the man whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "I need help," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "Tell her you're in trouble," he said. "I'm in trouble," I repeated, my whole body trembling. "Tell her to get $10,000, or she'll never see you again." I couldn't say it. My throat was closing up. But the man grabbed my arm, twisting it painfully. I gasped and repeated the words. "Get $10,000, or you'll never see me again." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear my sister's voice, frantic now, asking where I was, what had happened. But the man pulled the phone away and hung up. "Good," he said, standing up. "Now we wait." I don't know how long I was in that barn. Hours, maybe more. The two men left me alone most of the time, only coming in to check on me or give me water. I kept thinking about how I'd gotten here, how stupid I was for running without my phone, how no one knew where I was. But then, something happened. I overheard the younger man talking to the older one. They were outside the barn, but I could hear them through the cracks in the wall. They weren't planning to let me go. Even if they got the money, they were going to kill me. I started to panic, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. I had to do something. I started working at the ropes around my wrists, twisting my hands as best as I could. It hurt, the rope cutting into my skin, but I didn't stop. I kept at it until I felt the knot loosen just a little. It was enough. I managed to slip one hand free. My heart was pounding as I untied my other hand, then my ankles. I was free, but I didn't know what to do next. The barn was locked from the outside, and I didn't have any way to break out. I looked around the barn, my mind racing. There was a small window, high up on the wall. It was barely big enough for me to squeeze through, but it was my only chance. I grabbed one of the old tools lying around and started working at the boards covering the window. It was slow going, but I managed to pry one of them loose. I heard footsteps outside. The men were coming back, and I knew I didn't have much time. My hands were shaking as I worked faster, prying at the boards with all the strength I had left. One finally came loose enough for me to push through. I squeezed myself through the small opening, feeling the rough edges scrape against my skin, but I didn't care. I was desperate. I dropped to the ground outside the barn, the cold dirt hitting my knees as I landed. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline pumping through me. I couldn't stop to think. I just ran. The men were still inside, probably assuming I was tied up and helpless. The path leading back to the main road was long, and the field stretched for what felt like miles in every direction. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay anywhere near the barn. My legs ached, but I pushed through the pain, running faster than I ever had in my life. I stayed low, trying to use the tall grass and the dips in the ground to hide myself as much as possible. Every noise made my heart pound, my own breath, the sound of my shoes hitting the dirt, the rustling of the grass. I kept expecting to hear the truck start, for them to come after me, but there was nothing. The only sound was the wind cutting through the open fields. I had no sense of time. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I saw a faint glimmer of hope, a farmhouse in the distance, a small light glowing from its porch. It was the first sign of life I had seen since this nightmare began. I didn't stop to think. I made a beeline for it, my breath ragged and my legs feeling like they were about to give out. I was terrified that the men would catch me before I made it there, that this wasn't over yet. But I kept running, focusing on that single point of light ahead. When I finally reached the farmhouse, I was barely able to stand. I pounded on the door, too exhausted to scream. My fists hit the wood, weak and frantic. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and an older man stood there, his face twisted in confusion. "Please, help me," I gasped, collapsing to the ground at his feet. The man immediately pulled me inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind him. His wife appeared from another room, her eyes wide with shock when she saw me, covered in dirt and bleeding from the cuts on my arms. "We need to call the police," I said, barely able to get the words out. The man nodded, rushing to grab the phone. I could hear the faint sound of him talking to the 911 operator, but my mind was slipping, too overwhelmed by everything that had happened. I collapsed onto their couch, my body finally giving in to the exhaustion. The next thing I remember is the police arriving. The flashing lights filled the room, and I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. I was safe now. They took my statement, listened to everything I had been through, and assured me they would find the men who did this. It took hours for them to track down the barn, and when they got there, it was empty. The men were gone. But they found my ropes, the chair, the tools. They found evidence that I had been there, and that I had been telling the truth. I don't know what happened to those men. The police said they would keep looking, but they didn't seem hopeful. All I could do was try to move on, try to forget the feeling of their hands on me, the terror of being tied up in that barn. But even now, I still look over my shoulder when I run. Every time a car slows down near me, my heart races, and I can't help but think that one day, they might come back. I survived, but I don't think I'll ever really feel safe again. I rented the cabin because I needed to get away. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, one-room place in the woods. I'd found it online, advertised as off the grid and perfect for solitude. It sounded like exactly what I needed. Work had been killing me for months, and I felt like I was on the edge of burning out. My plan was simple: head out there, stay for the week, no phone, no emails, just some quiet time to reset. The owner of the place, a guy named Dan, gave me some vague directions to find it since there wasn't much out there and no GPS would work. That was part of the appeal. The first day was perfect. I spent it mostly reading and hiking around the property. The cabin sat near a small stream, and there were thick trees surrounding it in every direction. It was peaceful, isolated. You couldn't hear cars, people, or anything. Just the sound of nature, the way I wanted it. That night, after cooking some dinner on the little propane stove, I settled into the old couch with a book. It was pitch black outside by then. The cabin didn't have electricity, so I was using a lantern for light. I remember feeling good, calm for the first time in a long while. Then I heard it. A gunshot. I wasn't sure at first. It was distant, like it came from somewhere deeper in the woods. But it was unmistakable. A sharp, cracking sound. I sat up, listening. Maybe someone was hunting, I thought. People hunt in these woods, right? I didn't know for sure, but it made sense. I didn't know a lot about the area, but I figured it wasn't unusual. Then there was another shot. And another. 3 in total, each one sounding a little closer than the last. I felt a bit on edge but tried to calm myself down. People hunt. It's not that weird. I locked the door more out of habit than fear and went to bed. The next day was quiet. I didn't hear any more gunshots, and I tried to put it out of my mind. I spent most of the day hiking, exploring the woods around the cabin. It was a beautiful area, untouched by any kind of development, and it was easy to feel like you were the only person in the world. By the time I got back to the cabin that evening, I was exhausted. As the sun started setting, I made myself some dinner and sat outside on the small porch. That's when I saw him. A man was walking through the trees, coming from the direction of the trail I'd taken earlier. At first, I was just surprised. I hadn't seen anyone else out here, and I wasn't expecting visitors. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a rough look about him. His clothes were dirty, like he'd been out in the woods for days, and he was carrying a rifle slung over his shoulder. I stood up, trying to make it clear that I saw him. He didn't wave or call out. He just kept walking toward the cabin until he was about 20 feet away. Then he stopped and looked at me. I didn't know what to say. Something about the way he just stared made me nervous. "Can I help you?" I finally asked. He didn't answer right away, just kept staring. Then he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I'm renting this cabin." He shook his head. "Don't care. You need to leave. Now." There was no friendliness in his voice, no sense that this was just some misunderstanding. My heart started to pound a little harder. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Look, I'm just here for a few days. I rented it from Dan. I'm not causing any trouble." He took a step closer, his face hardening. "I don't care who you rented it from. You leave tonight, or you won't be leaving at all." That's when I noticed the way his hand rested on the rifle, just lightly, like a casual threat. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. This wasn't just some random local telling me to get lost. He meant it. I didn't know what to do, so I nodded. "All right," I said. "I'll pack up and leave." He didn't move for a few seconds, just kept staring at me. Then he turned and walked back into the woods without another word. As soon as he was out of sight, I rushed back into the cabin and locked the door. My mind was racing. Who the hell was that guy? And why did he want me gone so badly? I looked around the cabin, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't have my phone, there was no reception out here anyway, and the thought of driving down the narrow, winding dirt road in the dark terrified me. But staying in the cabin didn't feel safe either. I decided to leave. As soon as the sun set, I'd pack my things and get out. It was dark now, and the only light came from my lantern. I started packing up, trying to be as quiet as possible. The man's words kept playing in my head, the way he said I wouldn't be leaving if I stayed. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting him to appear outside. The silence was suffocating. Then I heard the gunshot again. This time, it was close. Too close. My heart jumped into my throat. It wasn't just a random hunter. He was out there, and he was getting closer. I rushed to grab my bag, fumbling with the zipper in my panic. Another gunshot rang out, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the distance. He was coming. I turned off the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness. My hands were shaking as I stood there, listening. The footsteps were getting closer. Slow, deliberate. He wasn't rushing. He knew exactly where I was. I ran to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to leave, but I also knew he was out there, waiting. My truck was parked about 50 yards from the cabin, but that felt like miles in the dark, especially with him nearby. I stood frozen by the door, trying to decide what to do. Then I heard his voice again, outside this time, just beyond the trees. "I told you to leave." His voice was calm, almost amused. My blood ran cold. He was playing with me. He wanted me to run, to make it more fun for him. I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my bag and opened the door as quietly as I could. The cold night air hit me, and I stepped out onto the porch. I could barely see anything in the darkness, but I knew the general direction of the truck. I just had to make it there before he saw me. I moved as fast as I could without making noise, keeping low to the ground. The trees cast long shadows, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept expecting to hear another gunshot, to feel the bullet hit me. But all I heard was the sound of my own breathing, ragged and panicked. I was halfway to the truck when I heard the snap of a twig behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. He was close, too close. I could feel him watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted the rest of the way to the truck, my feet pounding against the ground. I could hear him behind me now, crashing through the underbrush. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. Finally, I got the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut behind me. I started the engine just as I saw him emerge from the trees. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, his rifle raised. I threw the truck into reverse, backing out as fast as I could. A gunshot rang out, and I heard the sound of glass shattering as the bullet hit the back window. I didn't stop. I floored it, the tires spinning in the dirt as I sped down the narrow road. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt, but I didn't care. I just had to get out. I drove for what felt like hours, not slowing down until I was miles away from the cabin. Only then did I pull over, my body shaking uncontrollably. I sat there in the dark, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. I don't know who that man was or why he wanted me gone so badly. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going back to that cabin. I was driving through the desert, heading toward a small town that wasn't much more than a dot on the map. The kind of place where you stop for gas, maybe grab a coffee, and keep moving. It was just me in the car. I liked the quiet. I'd been on the road for a while, and the gas gauge was getting low, so when I saw a sign for a gas station up ahead, I figured I'd stop, fill up, and be on my way. It was one of those old, run-down places you barely see anymore, the kind with a single pump and a weathered building next to it. There were no other cars around, and the place looked almost abandoned. But I didn't have much of a choice. The next station wasn't for miles, and I wasn't about to risk running out of gas in the middle of nowhere. I pulled up to the pump, got out, and started filling the tank. The sun was brutal, the heat making everything shimmer. I wiped the sweat off my forehead and glanced around. It was dead quiet, no wind, no noise, just the sound of the pump ticking away. That's when I noticed the guy. He must have come out of the building, though I didn't see him at first. He was walking toward me, wearing a dirty t-shirt and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His hair was greasy, and he had this grin on his face that immediately put me on edge. He wasn't old, maybe in his 30s, but there was something off about him. His grin didn't reach his eyes. "Need help with that?" he asked, his voice too cheerful for the situation. "No, I'm good," I said quickly, hoping he'd take the hint. I didn't like the way he was looking at me, like he was sizing me up. I tried to focus on the pump, willing it to finish faster. "Not many people come through here," he continued, stepping a little closer. "Where are you headed?" I hesitated, not wanting to give him any details. "Just passing through." He kept grinning, leaning against the pump now, too close for comfort. "That's so? Must be lonely, driving out here all by yourself." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. His tone had changed, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. I didn't answer, just kept watching the numbers on the pump, praying for it to be done. "You should be careful out here," he said after a long pause. "A lot can happen on these roads, especially at night." The pump clicked, and I pulled the nozzle out, putting it back in place. My heart was racing now. I could feel his eyes on me as I walked around to the driver's side of the car, my hand shaking as I grabbed the door handle. "Hey," he called out, taking a step toward me. "You didn't pay yet." I froze. I hadn't even thought about it. My mind was too busy screaming at me to get out of there. I glanced at the building. The door was open, and the inside looked dark and cluttered. I really didn't want to go in there with him, but I had no choice. I had to pay. I left the door of the car open, hoping that maybe someone would drive by, someone who could see if anything went wrong. The guy followed me as I walked into the small, dimly lit shop. The air inside was thick and smelled like stale cigarettes and something else I couldn't place. There was a counter in the corner with an old cash register and a few dusty shelves filled with random junk. He stood behind me, too close, as I dug through my bag for my wallet. I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. My fingers fumbled, and I dropped the wallet. Before I could reach down to pick it up, he stepped forward, blocking my path. He picked it up slowly, holding it out to me with that same creepy grin. "Here you go," he said, his voice low now. I took it from him, my hand shaking as I pulled out some cash. When I handed him the money, he didn't take it right away. He just stared at me for a few seconds, like he was thinking about something. Finally, he grabbed the bills from my hand and shoved them into his pocket, not even bothering to ring it up. "You be careful out there," he said again, his eyes narrowing just a little. "You never know who you might run into." I didn't respond. I turned and walked out of the building as fast as I could without looking like I was running. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. All I wanted was to get back in my car and get as far away from the place as possible. I reached the car, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I put the key in the ignition. I turned the key, but the engine didn't start. It just clicked. I tried again. Nothing. My stomach dropped. I tried once more, harder this time, like maybe that would make a difference, but it didn't. The engine wouldn't turn over. I sat there, staring at the dashboard, panic creeping in. I knew what this meant. I didn't know how, but somehow the guy had done something to my car. I looked up, and there he was, standing just outside the gas station, watching me. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was blank, but his eyes were dark, colder than before. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in the car, but I couldn't get out either. He started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. My mind was racing, trying to figure out a way out of this. I popped the hood. Maybe I could fix it. Maybe it was something simple. I opened the door, forcing myself to act normal, like I wasn't terrified, like I didn't know he was coming for me. I walked around to the front of the car, lifting the hood, pretending to look at the engine, though I had no idea what I was doing. He was closer now, just a few feet away. I could hear his footsteps crunching in the gravel. My heart was pounding in my ears. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice too casual. I didn't answer. I was trying to think, trying to figure out some way to get out of this. My mind was blank, panic taking over. He was right there now, standing next to me, looking down at the engine. "Looks like you're stuck here," he said softly, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. Without thinking, I slammed the hood down, the noise startling both of us. Before he could react, I ran to the driver's side, grabbed my phone from the seat, and bolted. I didn't know where I was going. There was nothing but desert in every direction, but staying there with him felt like a death sentence. I heard him yell something behind me, but I didn't look back. My legs were burning, my lungs on fire, but I kept running. I had no plan, no idea what to do next. My phone was useless without service, but I clutched it like a lifeline anyway. I could hear his footsteps behind me now, faster, angrier. He was chasing me. I pushed myself harder, my heart pounding in my chest. The heat was unbearable, the sun burning down on me. My body screamed for me to stop, but I couldn't. I had to keep going. Then, just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I saw it. A car coming down the road. A miracle. I waved my arms, screaming, running toward it like it was my only hope. It slowed down, and the driver, an older man, looked at me with confusion as I ran up to his window. "Please," I gasped. "Please, help me." He didn't ask questions. He unlocked the door, and I scrambled inside just as I heard the other man's footsteps behind me. I slammed the door shut and locked it. "Drive!" I shouted, and the old man, sensing the urgency, floored it. As we sped away, I glanced back. The guy from the gas station was standing in the middle of the road, watching us go, his face twisted in anger. I didn't look for long. I didn't want to see what was in his eyes. The old man didn't say much as he drove. He didn't need to. I was safe now, and that was all that mattered. I didn't know what that guy had planned for me, and I didn't want to find out. All I knew was that I wasn't going back to that gas station or anywhere near it ever again. I remember when Tom first pitched the idea of a wilderness survival trip. We'd known each other for years, so it didn't seem strange when he suggested it. We both liked the outdoors, camping, hiking, things like that. But this trip was supposed to be different. No phones, no GPS, just us and whatever we could carry on our backs for a week. It sounded like a challenge, and I was all in. I trusted Tom. There was no reason not to. We drove out to this remote area about 5 hours from the city, deep into the mountains. No trails, no marked campsites, just wild, untamed land. It was beautiful in an isolated way, nothing but trees and the distant sound of a river somewhere nearby. The air felt cleaner out there, untouched. The first couple of days went fine. We set up camp, caught fish, built fires. It was tough but manageable. The whole point was to live off the land, and we were doing it. But looking back, I realized there were small things that started to feel off. Tom was quieter than usual, not his normal self. He wasn't joking around like he always did, wasn't complaining when something was hard. He seemed too focused, too serious. I chalked it up to him being into the challenge, but there was something more. I just didn't see it yet. On the third day, we hiked further into the woods, away from the river, up toward the mountains. It was steep, and the trail, if you could call it that, was rough. We barely saw any wildlife, which struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it. It was getting late, and we needed to set up camp again. That's when Tom suggested we stop at this small clearing, a little too open for my liking. I thought it'd make us easy targets for animals, but he insisted. I noticed something weird when I started unpacking my gear. One of my knives was missing. I knew I'd packed it, double-checked everything before we left, but it was just gone. I mentioned it to Tom, and he shrugged, didn't seem concerned. "You've still got your hatchet," he said. I figured I'd just misplaced it somehow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't me who'd lost it. That night was when everything started to shift. We were sitting around the fire, not saying much, just watching the flames. Tom finally spoke up, but the tone of his voice made me freeze. "You ever think about what it'd be like to just disappear out here?" he asked, staring into the fire, not looking at me. Like if someone just never came back. Nobody would ever know. I laughed, thinking he was trying to mess with me. "Yeah, I guess. Pretty easy to get lost out here." He didn't laugh back. He just looked at me, and there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. It wasn't the look of someone joking around. It was cold, almost calculating. Nah, I mean on purpose, he said. What if someone didn't want to come back? Or what if they didn't let someone else come back? I stared at him, waiting for him to crack a smile, tell me he was kidding. But he didn't. My stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. Tom, what are you talking about? He didn't answer right away, just kept poking at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the night. Just saying, out here, it'd be easy. Nobody would find you. I tried to laugh it off, tried to tell myself it was just the isolation getting to him. But something about the way he was acting made me uneasy. I decided to change the subject, asked him about the hike we had planned for the next day, but the tension didn't leave the air. We turned in not long after that. I couldn't sleep, though. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring up at the sky, my mind racing. Tom's words kept echoing in my head. I wanted to believe he was just talking nonsense, but the feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard movement. Quiet, almost like someone was trying not to wake me. I stayed still, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of soft footsteps, moving away from the camp. I slowly sat up, careful not to make any noise. Tom's sleeping bag was empty. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped out of my bag, my fingers shaking as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the trees around the clearing. No sign of him. I called his name, softly at first, then louder. No answer. Panic set in. I grabbed my hatchet, the only weapon I had left, and started walking toward the edge of the clearing, scanning the woods. That's when I heard it. A snap of a branch, not too far away. I pointed the flashlight in that direction, and there he was, standing just beyond the tree line. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me. In his hand, he was holding something. My missing knife. Tom, I said, my voice shaking, what the hell are you doing? He didn't answer right away. He just took a step closer, the knife glinting in the beam of my flashlight. You know, he finally said, I've been thinking about this for a while. What it would be like to just walk out of the woods alone. What people would say. How they'd react when you didn't come back. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what he was saying, but nothing fit. This wasn't Tom. This wasn't the guy I'd known for years. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, backing up a step, gripping the hatchet tighter. We're going back tomorrow. Both of us. He smiled then, but it wasn't the kind of smile that put you at ease. It was the kind of smile that made your blood run cold. Not both of us, he said, taking another step toward me. One of us. That's when it hit me. This wasn't some messed up joke. He wasn't losing it from being out here too long. He had planned this. He'd brought me out here for this. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline kicking in. I didn't wait for him to take another step. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, just deeper into the woods, away from him. I could hear him behind me, running too, the sound of his footsteps getting closer. I pushed myself harder, branches whipping against my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet. My lungs were burning, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let him catch me. I stumbled, nearly falling, but I caught myself and kept going. I didn't dare look back. I knew he was right behind me. I could feel it. Then, out of nowhere, the ground gave way beneath me. I slid down a steep embankment, crashing through bushes and rocks, tumbling to the bottom. Pain shot through my ankle as I hit the ground hard. I gasped, trying to catch my breath, but the pain was overwhelming. I tried to stand, but my ankle gave out, sending me crashing back to the ground. I heard him at the top of the hill, his footsteps slowing. He was close, too close. I crawled, dragging myself behind a large boulder, hoping the darkness would hide me. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he'd hear it. I heard him moving, slowly, searching. He was toying with me now, drawing it out. "You can't run forever," he called out, his voice almost sing-song. "It's just you and me out here. No one's coming to save you." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying he wouldn't find me. I was trapped, nowhere to go, no way to fight him off. But then, through the panic, I remembered the hatchet still clutched in my hand. My only chance. I waited, listening to his footsteps, trying to gauge how close he was. He was circling, getting closer, his breathing steady, calm. Then he was there, right on the other side of the boulder. I could see his shadow moving, hear the sound of the knife scraping against the rock as he dragged it along the surface. I didn't think. I just acted. I swung the hatchet with everything I had, blind, desperate. It connected with something solid, and there was a sickening thud, followed by a gasp. The knife clattered to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain in my ankle, and ran. I didn't look back, didn't check to see if he was down. I just ran. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually, I found the road, the one we'd driven in on. I limped along it until I found help, someone who could get me out of there. I never saw Tom again. I was driving back from my sister's place. It was late, and I wanted to get home before it got too dark, but somewhere along the way, I missed a turn. I don't even know how it happened. I swear I was following the directions. One minute, I was on a highway, and the next, I was winding through narrow roads with no signs, no lights, nothing. I kept telling myself I'd find my way back, but the more I drove, the more I realized I was completely lost. It was one of those stretches of road where it felt like no one had been through in ages. Trees on either side, the sky starting to darken, and not another car in sight. After what felt like an hour of driving aimlessly, I saw a sign that said there was a town up ahead. It wasn't on my GPS, but I figured it might have a gas station, maybe a place to stop and ask for directions. At this point, my gas gauge was dipping low, and my phone had no signal, so I didn't have much of a choice. The town wasn't far off. There wasn't any grand entrance, no signs welcoming me. It just sort of appeared. The buildings were old, like something out of a different time, brick and wood, some of them boarded up. I remember thinking it felt abandoned. I drove slowly down the main street, looking for signs of life. A gas station, a convenience store, anything. But the streets were empty. No cars, no people, no lights in the windows. It was like the place had been frozen in time and then forgotten. I pulled over near what looked like a general store. The windows were dusty, but there were shelves inside, though they looked bare. I turned off the engine and sat there for a minute, listening. Nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the soft creak of my car settling. That's when I noticed how quiet it was. No wind, no birds, no distant hum of anything. I got out of the car, thinking I could maybe knock on a door, see if anyone was around. As soon as I stepped out, the air felt thick. I can't explain it, but it was like everything around me was holding its breath. I walked over to the general store and tried the door. It was locked, of course. I looked up and down the street, hoping for some sign of life, but there was nothing. I started walking, just to get a better look at the place. It wasn't a big town, but as I made my way down the road, I started noticing things. Small things. Like, one of the streetlights had its bulb broken, but not shattered, more like it had been taken apart piece by piece. A window on a nearby house had a curtain pulled back just slightly, as if someone had been peeking out and let it fall into place when they saw me. I was getting that feeling in my stomach, you know the one. Like when you walk into a room and know someone's been there, but there's no one in sight. I turned around, ready to go back to my car and get out of there, but when I looked back, something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The car was still there. The street still empty. But it was like the air had shifted. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the sudden urge to walk faster. I glanced at the buildings as I passed, and I swore I saw a shadow move inside one of them, but when I stopped to look, there was nothing. I was almost back to my car when I heard a sound. It was faint, like a whisper or a sigh, but it was enough to make me freeze. I turned slowly, trying to pinpoint where it came from. Across the street, there was an alleyway between two buildings. Dark, narrow, nothing special. But something about it felt wrong. Like someone was standing just inside the shadows, watching me. I took a step back, heart racing, and turned to get to my car as fast as I could without breaking into a run. My keys were in my hand, and I was fumbling to unlock the door when I heard it again, this time louder. It was a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across concrete. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see what was making that noise. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the keys, but I got the door open and slid inside, slamming it shut behind me. I locked the doors, started the car, and hit the gas. I pulled out fast, tires screeching against the pavement. As I sped down the street, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror, and for just a second, I saw someone standing in the middle of the road where my car had been. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching me drive away. I didn't slow down. I kept driving, turning onto the first road that led out of town, not caring where it took me. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. It took me a while to find a main road again, and by the time I did, it was almost dark. My phone still had no signal, but I didn't care. I was far enough away from that place, and that's all that mattered. I don't know what that town was, or who was there. I don't know if they were following me or if it was all in my head. But I'm never going back to find out. Something wasn't right about that place. I've never felt fear like that before, like someone was right there, watching, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I got home late that night, way later than I should have. I didn't tell anyone what happened, mostly because I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. But I haven't stopped thinking about it. I wasn't even supposed to be out there that day. It was one of those lazy weekends where I'd planned to stay in, maybe catch up on some shows or whatever. But the sun was shining, and I got restless. So I grabbed my backpack, filled it with some snacks and a water bottle, and decided to head out to the old quarry. It's a place I'd heard about from some friends, an abandoned site just outside town, but I'd never actually been. They said it was quiet, peaceful, a good spot to clear your head. The drive out was uneventful, just miles of flat, empty road, the kind you can lose yourself on if you're not paying attention. By the time I reached the turnoff for the quarry, the sky had started to cloud over, but I wasn't too worried. I figured I'd be in and out in an hour or two, just a quick hike and then back home. I parked near a rusted old gate that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There wasn't a soul around. The place was completely abandoned. No cars, no houses, No sounds except for the wind and the crunch of gravel under my boots as I walked. It was eerie, but also kind of nice. I liked being out there alone, just me and my thoughts. The quarry itself was huge, a deep pit carved into the earth with sheer rock walls on all sides. You could see where they used to mine the stone, layers and layers of rock exposed, like the earth had been peeled back. The ground was littered with broken machinery, rusted out trucks, and piles of rubble. It was like stepping into another world, one that had been forgotten a long time ago. I walked around the edge of the quarry for a while, just taking it all in. The drop down into the pit was steep, maybe 50 or 60 feet, and there were no fences or anything to stop you from going over the edge if you weren't careful. I found a spot where the slope wasn't too bad, more of a gradual incline, and decided to make my way down into the quarry itself. It didn't look that difficult. I've done my fair share of hiking and climbing before, so I figured it wouldn't be a big deal. At first, it wasn't. The ground was loose, a mix of dirt and small rocks, but I took it slow and kept my balance. I made it about halfway down when I heard it. A low rumble, like distant thunder. I stopped, looked around, but the sky was still clear enough. That's when the ground under my feet shifted. Just a little at first, then more. Suddenly, the whole slope started to give way. I tried to move, to get out of the way, but I was too slow. The ground collapsed beneath me, and before I knew it, I was sliding down, rocks and dirt tumbling all around me. I grabbed at anything I could, but there was nothing solid to hold on to. I hit the bottom hard, the wind knocked out of me, dust and debris flying everywhere. When it finally stopped, I was lying flat on my back at the bottom of the quarry, covered in dirt, my legs scraped up from the fall. I sat up slowly, coughing, trying to catch my breath. I wasn't hurt too bad, just shaken up. But when I looked up, I realized how far I'd fallen. The slope I'd come down was now a pile of rubble, too loose to climb back up. The walls of the quarry were sheer, with no easy way out. I was stuck. At first, I didn't panic. I figured I could find another way out. There had to be something, a path, a ladder, maybe even an old road that led out of the pit. I started walking, scanning the walls for any kind of break or opening. But as I made my way around the perimeter of the quarry, it became clear that there was no easy way out. The walls were too high, too steep, and I didn't have any climbing gear. I was completely trapped down there. That's when I noticed them. At first, I thought I was seeing things. I looked up to the top of the quarry, where the cliffs met the sky, and there they were, figures, standing at the edge, just looking down at me. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but they were too far away to make out any details. There were at least 4 or 5 of them, just standing there, motionless. I waved, shouted up at them. "Hey! Can you help me? I'm stuck down here." No response. They didn't move. Just kept standing there, watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine. Maybe they hadn't heard me, I thought. Maybe they couldn't see me from that distance. I waved again, more frantically this time, and shouted louder. "Hey! I need help. Can you hear me?" Still nothing. They didn't even flinch. It was like they were statues, just standing at the edge, staring down into the pit. I tried to tell myself they were just random people, maybe some hikers or locals who'd come to check out the quarry, but something about the way they were standing, so still, so quiet, unnerved me. I started to get desperate. I shouted again, my voice cracking. "Please. I'm stuck down here. I need help." And then, one of them moved. Slowly, one of the figures stepped closer to the edge, leaned forward just slightly, as if to get a better look at me. I felt a surge of hope. Maybe they were finally going to help. But instead of calling down or making any kind of gesture, the figure just stood there, peering down at me like I was some kind of curiosity. And then, one by one, the others stepped forward too, all of them standing right at the edge now, looking down at me. I backed away, my heart pounding. Something was wrong. Why weren't they saying anything? Why weren't they helping? I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just stand there, waiting for them to make a move. I had to find a way out, and fast. I turned and started walking again, trying to keep my focus on the walls of the quarry, looking for anything, any handhold, any ledge I could use to climb out. But the whole time, I could feel their eyes on me, watching my every move. I walked the entire perimeter of the quarry, and there was nothing. No exit, no ladder, no tools left behind that I could use. I was completely trapped. I tried to climb the walls a few times, but the rock was too unstable. Every time I grabbed a handhold, it crumbled under my fingers, sending me sliding back down. My hands were bleeding, my legs shaking from the effort, but I kept trying, because the alternative, staying down there with those people watching me, was worse. After what felt like hours, I collapsed onto the ground, exhausted and terrified. I looked up again, and they were still there, still watching. But now, one of them had started to move. Slowly, deliberately, they began to walk along the edge of the quarry, tracing the same path I had just walked. The others followed, keeping their eyes on me the whole time. I don't know why, but that's when I finally lost it. I scrambled to my feet and started shouting again, my voice hoarse from the dust and fear. What do you want? Why won't you help me? No answer. Just the sound of their footsteps, slow and steady, as they circled the top of the quarry. They were closer now, moving in sync, like a group of predators closing in on their prey. I backed away, stumbling over the loose rocks, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what they were planning, but I knew I couldn't stay down there much longer. I had to get out, even if it meant risking another landslide or hurting myself in the process. I started climbing again, my fingers digging into the dirt, my feet slipping on the loose rocks. I didn't care how much it hurt. I didn't care how many times I fell. I just had to get out, away from those people, away from whatever they were planning to do. I was halfway up the wall when I heard a voice, soft and low, carried on the wind. It wasn't coming from the figures above. It was coming from behind me, down in the pit. I froze, my hands clinging to the rock, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. Slowly, I turned my head, just enough to see over my shoulder. There, at the bottom of the quarry, was another figure, standing perfectly still, watching me. I never thought a drive through the countryside would turn into something like this. I had taken the back roads after leaving my friend's house late at night, enjoying the quiet and the stars. There was something peaceful about it until it happened. I was cruising along, the radio playing softly, when out of nowhere, a deer darted across the road. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The thud echoed in the silence, and my heart sank as I felt my car shudder from the impact. I pulled over to the side of the road, shaking. The deer lay still on the pavement. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I stepped out of the car, my legs feeling weak. The deer was alive but injured. It struggled, its eyes wide with fear. I stood there for a moment, feeling helpless. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't call anyone. I had no signal out here. The last thing I wanted was to just leave it there to suffer. I took a deep breath and got back into the car. I had to think. Maybe I could find a house nearby, ask for help. I grabbed my phone, but there was still no signal. I looked around, trying to figure out where I was. It was pitch dark, and all I could see were fields stretching out in every direction. Then, I noticed a light in the distance. It flickered like a lantern, maybe from a farmhouse or a barn. I felt a little relief. I could walk there, maybe get help for the deer, or at least call someone. So, I locked the car and headed toward the light, my heart still racing from the accident. I walked along the edge of the road, the gravel crunching under my shoes. The fields on either side of me seemed endless. I had only gone a few hundred feet when I turned and looked back. My car was just a tiny dark shape against the backdrop of the moonlit road. I felt a twinge of anxiety but brushed it off. I focused on the light ahead. After a while, I reached the edge of a cornfield. The tall stalks loomed over me, swaying gently in the night breeze. I could see the light now, glowing warmly from what looked like a small farmhouse at the other end of the field. I figured it would be faster to cut through the corn than walk all the way around it. I stepped into the rows, the leaves brushing against my arms, making a soft rustling sound. As I walked, the light seemed to flicker, and the air felt thick around me. I tried to keep calm, reminding myself that it was just a cornfield. I picked my way through the rows, trying to keep my bearings, but everything looked the same. I felt a little disoriented, as if the stalks were closing in around me. I stopped and listened. At first, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. But then I heard a rustle. It was soft, almost too soft to notice. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was coming from somewhere behind me, deeper into the cornfield. I looked back, but I could not see anything. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks. I took a few more steps, but the feeling of being watched settled over me like a heavy blanket. I turned again, scanning the rows for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the stillness of the field. I took a deep breath, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Then I heard it again, a soft rustling, but this time closer. I felt the hairs on my neck stand on end. I was not alone. I turned quickly, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was behind me. I half expected to see a deer, or maybe a raccoon, but there was nothing. Just the empty rows stretching out before me. I kept moving, but my pace quickened. Each step felt like a drumbeat in my ears. I could hear the rustling again, this time to my left, then to my right. Someone was moving through the corn. I couldn't see them, but I could feel it, a presence just beyond the edges of my vision. I picked up my pace, adrenaline flooding my veins. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is anyone there?" Silence. The rustling stopped. I could feel my heart pounding harder in my chest. I had to get out of the cornfield. I turned and tried to head toward the light, but every direction felt the same. Panic clawed at my throat. I could not just stand there, waiting. I started to jog, weaving through the rows, but the sound came back right behind me. It was no longer just rustling, it was footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone was stalking me. I turned again, but I saw nothing. Just the dark shapes of the stalks, towering over me like they were closing in. I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I could not let them catch me. The light ahead seemed farther away, flickering like a distant star. I kept my eyes fixed on it, praying it would be my salvation. Then, I heard a voice, low and muffled, echoing through the corn. "Where are you going?" It was right behind me. I stumbled, my feet tripping over the uneven ground. I didn't know who it was, but I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I had to keep moving. "Please, just leave me alone," I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. I felt the tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I sprinted toward the light, the darkness closing in around me. I could not let them catch me. As I ran, I could hear them moving again, rushing through the rows, and the sound was getting closer. I felt the panic clawing in my chest, but I focused on the light. I was almost there. Finally, I broke free from the cornfield, bursting out into the open space just beyond. The light was blinding, and I squinted against it. I stumbled forward, and there it was, the farmhouse. I rushed toward the door, pounding on it with all my strength. "Help! Please!" I yelled, desperation spilling out in my voice. I could hear the rustling behind me still, the footsteps echoing in the distance. The door swung open, and an older man stood there, looking confused. "What's going on?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I didn't wait for him to say more. I pushed past him, gasping for air. "Someone is in the cornfield. They're following me." He glanced behind me, his face going pale. "Get inside. Now!" I rushed in, and he slammed the door shut, locking it tight. I could still hear the rustling outside, and I pressed my back against the door, my heart racing. "Who was it?" the man asked, looking alarmed. "Did you see them?" "No, but they were following me." I could hear them moving through the rows. I was shaking now, trying to catch my breath. The man peered through a small window, looking out into the darkness. "Stay here," he said, moving toward the door. "Please don't go out there. They could be dangerous." He turned back to me, his eyes steady. "I have to make sure you're safe." I watched him grab a flashlight and a baseball bat before he opened the door. I wanted to scream at him to stay inside, to protect himself, but I felt frozen. He stepped outside, and I could see him shining the flashlight into the cornfield. The beam danced around, illuminating the rows, but I could not see anything. Just darkness and the faint sound of rustling. "Is anyone out there?" he called out, his voice steady, but I could hear the tension behind it. The rustling stopped again. There was a moment of silence, and I held my breath, waiting. Then I heard a low laugh, cruel and mocking, echoing from the darkness. "Get back inside," I shouted, panic rising in my throat. I was terrified. The man turned back toward me, but before he could say anything, the rustling erupted again, louder this time, as if whatever had been lurking in the cornfield was moving toward us. "Now!" he yelled, rushing back toward the door, and I flung myself out of the way just as he slammed it shut behind him. We stood there, breathing heavily, listening as the sound continued, but it was fading now, drifting off into the distance. "Who were they?" I asked, my voice trembling. He shook his head. "I don't know, but you're safe now." As I stood there, still shaking, I realized I was finally out of the field, away from whatever had been stalking me. But the fear lingered. The night was dark, the world beyond the door still uncertain. I had always been drawn to the outdoors, finding peace in the stillness of the trees and the quiet of the mountains. When I heard about a survivalist group meeting deep in the wilderness, I thought it would be the perfect chance to learn new skills and be part of a community that shared my passion. The advertisement promised a week of training, teamwork, and the thrill of living off the land. I signed up without a second thought, eager to escape the chaos of my everyday life. The drive to the compound was longer than I expected. I turned off the main road, following a narrow dirt path that snaked through dense woods. As I drove deeper into the forest, the trees loomed overhead, blocking out much of the daylight. I felt a thrill of excitement mixed with a hint of apprehension. It was remote and beautiful, far from the noise of the city. When I arrived, I was greeted by a small group of people gathered around a fire pit. They looked rugged and prepared, dressed in survival gear and boots caked with dirt. The leader, a tall man with a long beard and piercing blue eyes, stepped forward to welcome me. "Welcome to our home. I'm Gideon. You will find that you are among friends here." I shook his hand, feeling a firm grip. The others smiled at me, their expressions warm yet guarded. It felt strange, like they were sizing me up. I brushed it off, reminding myself that I was there to learn. They showed me to a small cabin where I would be staying. It was rustic but cozy, surrounded by towering pines. The first day was filled with activities. We practiced building shelters, starting fires, and identifying edible plants. I was having a great time, even if I felt a little out of my element. The group worked well together, and I felt like I was becoming part of something bigger. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows, I began to notice something off about the dynamics within the group. That night, we gathered around the fire. Gideon spoke with fervor, sharing stories about survival and the importance of preparedness. The way he spoke was almost hypnotic, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. In the coming years, there will be challenges that test our resolve. We must be ready to protect what is ours. Trust and loyalty are paramount. You must understand that once you join this group, you are family. The others nodded in agreement, their faces serious. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wondered if they had taken this a bit too far, but I tried to shake off my discomfort. I had signed up for a survival experience, after all. I needed to give it time. The next day was more intense. We hiked deep into the forest, learning to track animals and set traps. I found myself enjoying the lessons, but there was an undercurrent of tension that I could not ignore. When we returned to the compound, I overheard Gideon speaking to a couple of the other members in hushed tones. Their faces were tight with worry. I felt an urge to know what they were talking about, but I didn't want to intrude. That evening, while the others were preparing dinner, I decided to take a walk around the compound. The air was cool, and the sounds of nature enveloped me. I wandered toward the edge of the property, where a chain-link fence surrounded the area. I noticed several warning signs about trespassing. It felt a bit unsettling, but I brushed it off, thinking they were just being cautious. As I turned to head back, I spotted a small shed hidden among the trees. My curiosity got the better of me. I approached it, feeling the pull of the unknown. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, I saw a few shelves stocked with supplies, but what caught my eye was a table covered with various tools and equipment that looked out of place. My heart raced as I noticed the items, a few old firearms, ropes, and even something that looked like a hunting knife. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find Gideon standing at the entrance, his expression dark. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. I stammered. I was just looking around. He stepped inside, blocking my way. "This is not a place for outsiders. You should know better than to wander off." I felt a surge of fear as he moved closer. "I'm sorry. I did not mean to intrude. I will go back now." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "You need to understand something. This group is not just about survival skills. It is about loyalty. If you cannot follow the rules, you may not be welcome here much longer." My mind raced. What had I gotten myself into? "I will follow the rules. I promise," I said, my voice shaky. He regarded me for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Good. We look out for one another. But you must never forget that leaving is not an option." I felt a chill run through me. I nodded, trying to mask my fear. Of course. I won't leave. Gideon stepped aside, allowing me to pass. I hurried back to the main area, my heart racing. The atmosphere had shifted, and I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me. I had thought I was among friends, but now I felt trapped. The next day, things only got worse. During a group exercise, I overheard Gideon speaking to a few members in low tones, their expressions grave. I caught snippets of their conversation, words like control, loyalty, and no one leaves. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was not just a survival group, it was something much darker. Panic surged within me. I needed to leave. I could not stay there any longer. As the day progressed, I kept my distance, searching for a chance to escape without drawing attention. I planned to leave under the cover of darkness, hoping to navigate back to my car. That night, I waited until the others settled down around the fire. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on their faces as they shared stories. I slipped away quietly, careful not to make any noise. I crept through the trees, my heart pounding. The moonlight guided me as I hurried toward the fence. Just as I reached the edge, I heard a voice behind me. "Where do you think you are going?" It was Gideon, standing there with several members behind him, their expressions serious. "You were not thinking of leaving, were you?" I froze, my mind racing. "I was just going for a walk. I needed some air." Gideon stepped closer, his eyes cold and unyielding. "You do not understand. You are part of this now. There is no going back. If you leave, it will not end well for you." Fear gripped me. I had to think quickly. "I just need to get my things. I promise I will come back." He shook his head slowly, a smile creeping onto his lips, but it did not reach his eyes. "You do not get it. No one leaves this place alive." The group shifted closer, and I felt trapped. Panic surged through me. I took a step back, glancing for an escape. I could not stay there. I had to get away. Suddenly, I turned and ran, darting through the trees. I could hear them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. My heart raced as I stumbled through the underbrush, branches scratching at my skin. The sounds of their footsteps echoed in my ears, growing closer. I kept running, adrenaline pushing me forward. I had to reach my car. I could not let them catch me. I ran blindly, praying for the dirt road to appear. My lungs burned, and I felt like I might collapse, but I pressed on. Finally, I burst through the trees and found the road. My car was just a few yards away, a beacon of hope in the dark. I fumbled for my keys, my hand shaking as I unlocked the door. I jumped in and slammed it shut, locking it tight. I could still hear their voices, distant but approaching. I turned the ignition and the engine roared to life. I threw the car into gear, spinning the tires in the dirt as I raced down the road. I didn't look back, focusing only on the way ahead. The trees blurred past, and I felt a rush of relief wash over me. I drove for what felt like an eternity, the fear slowly fading as I put distance between myself and the compound. My heart was still racing, but I knew I was safe. I had escaped, but I could not shake the feeling of dread. I had narrowly avoided something dark and twisted. As I drove away from the wilderness, I promised myself I would never let my curiosity lead me into a situation like that again. The storm hit suddenly. One moment, the sky was a dull gray, and the next, it exploded into a cacophony of thunder and torrential rain. I was driving back home from visiting a friend in the next town over when the first flash of lightning lit up the sky. The winds picked up, bending the trees and tossing debris around like it was nothing. I knew I needed to find shelter. As I pulled over to the side of the road, I spotted a small field ahead with what looked like an old storm shelter nestled among the tall grass. I could hardly see it through the sheets of rain, but it seemed like the only option I had. I threw my car into park and jumped out, the rain instantly soaking me to the bone. I ran toward the shelter, heart pounding with both fear and adrenaline. The door was heavy, made of rusted metal. I pulled and pushed until it creaked open, revealing a dark, damp interior. I stepped inside, shivering as I closed the door behind me. I could hardly make out anything in the dim light, but it smelled of mildew and earth. My phone had lost signal the moment the storm began, and I realized I could be trapped here for a while. I listened to the storm rage outside, the wind howling like a wild animal. I took a few cautious steps inside, feeling the cold ground beneath my feet. That is when I heard it, a low sound, like someone breathing. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I was not alone. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer came. The only sound was the storm raging outside and that persistent breathing. I turned slowly, scanning the shadows, but I could not see anyone. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but the storm was relentless, pounding against the shelter's metal roof. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. A voice broke through the darkness. "Who's there?" It was rough, gravelly, as if the speaker hadn't used it in years. I'm just seeking shelter from the storm." I did not mean to intrude. My words sounded weak, even to my own ears. "You shouldn't be here," the voice said, closer now. I could see a figure shifting in the shadows, illuminated by the faint light seeping through the cracks in the walls. "This place is not for you." My stomach churned. "I'll leave as soon as the storm passes. I just need a moment." I took a step back, toward the door, but my feet felt like lead. "Leaving is not an option," the voice said, a hint of something menacing creeping into his tone. I took a deep breath, trying to compose myself. "Please, I will not cause any trouble. I just need to wait for the storm to end." The figure stepped forward, and I finally saw him. He was tall and thin, with unkempt hair and wild eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. He looked disheveled, as if he had been living in this shelter for a long time. The sight of him sent a chill down my spine. "You have no idea what you are asking for," he said, his voice dripping with a strange kind of calmness. "People like you do not belong here. This is my home." "I understand," I replied, my voice trembling. "I will stay quiet. I promise. Just until the storm passes." He tilted his head, studying me with those piercing eyes. "Why do you think you can just come in here? You think you can just walk away once you feel safe?" I backed away slowly, looking for an escape, but there was none. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air growing thick with tension. "I do not want any trouble. I just need to leave." He laughed, a low, unsettling sound. "You do not get to leave. I have made this place my home, and you will learn to respect that." I glanced around, searching for something, anything I could use to defend myself. There was nothing but darkness and dampness, and my heart raced as panic set in. "Please, let me go. I will not tell anyone I was here." "Do you think that matters?" he asked, stepping closer. "You came here uninvited. You have to learn the consequences of your actions." He reached for me, and I instinctively stepped back, my back hitting the cold metal of the wall. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking. "You should not have come here," he said, almost like he was trying to teach me a lesson. The wildness in his eyes grew more intense, and I felt the gravity of his intentions. I needed to escape. I could not let him have me. I took a deep breath and suddenly charged for the door, pushing past him with all my strength. The door was still heavy, and I struggled to pull it open, but he was right behind me. His hand gripped my arm, yanking me back. I twisted and fought, panic overwhelming me. "Let go!" I screamed, kicking out at him. He stumbled back, surprised by my sudden strength. I seized the opportunity and flung myself against the door, finally managing to force it open. The wind and rain rushed in, howling like a beast, and I stumbled outside. The storm was still raging, but I did not care. I ran, my feet slipping in the mud as I sprinted toward my car. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I did not stop. I had to make it out. I could not let him catch me. I reached my car, fumbling for the keys as I jumped inside. I locked the doors, breathing heavily as I glanced back at the shelter. The figure stood in the doorway, rain pouring down his face, a wild look in his eyes. I turned the ignition, and the engine roared to life. My hands trembled as I shifted into drive, glancing back once more before speeding away. I drove as fast as I could, the rain pelting my windshield, blurring my vision. Every second felt like an eternity, but I kept my foot pressed down, eager to put as much distance between myself and that storm shelter as possible. The road was familiar again, and soon I was back on the main highway, my heart still racing. I did not stop until I reached home, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it tight. I could still hear the storm raging outside, but now I felt safe. The fear slowly faded, replaced by the weight of what I had just escaped. That storm shelter was no place for anyone. I knew I would never be able to shake the memory of that man and the dark intent behind his words. I learned that sometimes the safest places are not the ones that seem inviting, but the ones you can trust. I had always thought of myself as an outdoorsy type. I enjoyed hiking and exploring nature, and when I decided to take a trip to the swamps, it felt like a great idea at the time. I pictured the beauty of the landscape, the stillness of the water, and the chance to immerse myself in something wild and untouched. What I did not consider was how easy it could be to get lost. The first few hours were wonderful. The sun was shining through the trees, and the sounds of the swamp were oddly calming. I followed a narrow path that twisted through the cypress trees, and I felt completely at ease. As I walked, I snapped a few pictures, enjoying the vibrant greens and browns of the landscape. But as the day wore on, the sky darkened, and I lost my sense of direction. I knew I should have turned back, but I pushed deeper into the swamp, convinced I could find my way out. I stepped through the muck and mire, each step becoming harder than the last. The trees grew denser, and the air thickened with humidity. Soon, the path disappeared altogether, and I was surrounded by a maze of trees and water. I felt a creeping panic, the kind that tightened in your chest and made it hard to breathe. After what felt like hours of wandering, I realized I had no idea where I was. My phone had no signal, and the sun was sinking lower in the sky. I could hear the distant calls of birds settling in for the night, and the quiet sounds of the swamp felt unnerving. I knew I had to find shelter or risk spending the night out here. As I continued to stumble through the underbrush, I heard voices. They were faint at first, just a low murmur, but they grew louder. My heart raced with hope as I followed the sounds. Maybe they could help me find my way back. I emerged from the trees and into a small clearing, where I saw a group of people gathered around a fire. They looked rough, dressed in worn clothing, and they turned to stare at me as I stepped into the light. "Hey there," one of them called out, a tall man with a scruffy beard. "You lost?" I nodded, relieved to see them. "Yes, I got turned around out here. I was hoping you could help me." The group exchanged glances, and I could feel a strange tension in the air. The man smiled, but there was something unsettling about it. "Of course. You can come to our camp. We'll take care of you." I hesitated for a moment, but the thought of being lost and alone in the swamp filled me with dread. "Thank you," I said, feeling a mixture of gratitude and unease. They beckoned me closer, and I joined them around the fire. The warmth felt good against the cool evening air. The group consisted of 5 people: the man who had spoken, a woman with long, tangled hair, and 3 others who sat quietly, their expressions unreadable. They seemed friendly enough, though I felt a strange chill as I looked into their eyes. "Where are you from?" the woman asked. "Just a town nearby." "I thought I could handle the swamp on my own," I replied, forcing a laugh to ease the tension. "You are brave to venture out here alone," the man said. "Most people don't know what they're getting into." "I see that now," I admitted, looking around the camp. The flickering firelight danced across their faces, but the shadows made it hard to read their expressions. "Let us get you something to eat," the man offered. He reached into a cooler and pulled out a couple of cans. "We have plenty to share." I was starving, so I accepted. The food tasted good, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I ate, I watched the others closely. They were too quiet, too focused on me. I started to notice how they exchanged glances, how their smiles never quite reached their eyes. "Do you come here often?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Sometimes," the woman replied. "It's a good place to get away from everything. No distractions. Just the swamp and us." The man nodded, his gaze steady on me. "This place is safe. We take care of our own." A knot tightened in my stomach. The way he said it made me feel like I wasn't part of their group, like I was something else entirely. I glanced around again, trying to formulate a plan in my mind. I needed to get out of there, but how? As the night deepened, the fire crackled and popped, and the shadows grew longer. I felt the urge to leave, but I didn't want to raise suspicion. I casually looked around the campsite, searching for an escape route. The trees formed a thick wall around us, and I could hear the sounds of the swamp in the distance. My heart pounded louder as I started to think about my options. "Why don't you stay the night?" the man suggested suddenly. "It is dangerous out here alone. You can rest and leave in the morning." "No, I really should go," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I appreciate your hospitality, but I need to get back." The group exchanged looks again. The tension in the air felt thicker now, and I realized that I needed to leave immediately. I made my decision and stood up. "Thank you for the food, but I need to go now," I said firmly. The man's expression shifted, his smile disappearing. "You do not understand. It is not safe for you out there." "I can take care of myself," I insisted. "You do not have a choice," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You are not leaving." Fear coursed through me, and I turned to run, but the woman blocked my path. "You do not want to upset him," she said, her tone now cold and threatening. Adrenaline surged, and I pushed past her, bolting into the darkness of the swamp. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled over roots and muck, but I kept running. I could hear them shouting behind me, their voices blending into the sounds of the night. The swamp felt alive around me, the sounds of insects and animals rising in a frenzy. I was disoriented, the trees looming over me like giants. I forced myself to keep moving, to think. I needed to find my way back to the main path, back to my car. I ran blindly through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear them crashing through the trees behind me, getting closer. My heart raced as I darted between the cypress trees, praying I would find an opening, a way out. Finally, I spotted a faint light through the trees, a glimmer of hope. I pushed toward it, crashing through the thick brush, and stumbled into a small clearing. It was the main path. Relief washed over me, but I had no time to rest. I could still hear them coming. I turned and ran down the path, forcing myself to keep moving. The sound of their footsteps echoed behind me, and I could feel the weight of their intentions closing in. The path narrowed, and I saw the glow of headlights in the distance. My car was just ahead. With every ounce of strength I had left, I sprinted toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached my car, fumbled for my keys, and unlocked the door. I jumped inside and slammed the door shut, locking it tight. I could hear them shouting, but I didn't look back. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. I peeled out of that swamp, the tires spinning in the mud as I sped away. I could still hear the distant shouts fading behind me as I drove toward the safety of the road. The weight of fear slowly lifted as I put miles between myself and that camp. I never went back to the swamps again. That night changed something in me. I learned that not everyone you meet has good intentions, and sometimes the wilderness can be far more dangerous than you realize. The first night at the cabin was quiet, too quiet. I had rented it for a weekend retreat, a break from my busy life. The woods surrounded the place, and I felt excited to be away from everything, even if it was a bit isolated. I arrived late and spent the evening settling in, admiring the rustic charm and the stillness of the night. I woke up the next morning to the soft light filtering through the windows. I stretched and glanced outside, but something felt off. The air was thick, and the stillness outside felt heavy. I stepped out onto the porch and noticed the ground was different. There were ropes and wooden stakes sticking out of the dirt, but my sleepiness clouded my thoughts. I chalked it up to the remnants of an old hunting camp. As I wandered the property, I found more of them traps. They were crude but effective. Some looked like bear traps, while others were simple snares made from twine and sticks. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Who would set these up here? I backed away slowly, feeling a sudden sense of vulnerability. I was alone, and there was no cell service out here. I returned inside, locking the door. I tried to shake the feeling, pouring myself a cup of coffee and forcing myself to relax. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at me like a persistent itch. I sat in front of the fireplace, staring into the flames, listening for any sign of movement outside. Hours passed, and the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. Suddenly, I heard a sound outside, a crack of a branch. My heart raced as I turned to look out the window. I saw a figure in the distance. He stood still, partially hidden among the trees. He was dressed in worn, camouflage clothing, and his eyes were fixed on the cabin. I felt a rush of panic. Who was he? What did he want? I watched him for what felt like an eternity. He seemed to be studying the cabin, and then he began moving toward it. My instinct screamed at me to hide, so I ducked down behind the couch, barely breathing. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, a terrifying drumbeat of impending doom. I could see through the window just enough to watch him approach. He stopped in front of the door, looking up and down the sides of the cabin. I wanted to scream, to run, but I stayed silent, frozen in place. After what felt like hours, he finally moved away from the door, but my relief was short-lived. I could hear the sound of the door creaking open. He had found another way in. I crawled quietly to the back of the cabin, searching for a place to hide. The man's voice rang out, low and gravelly. "I know you are in there." The door slammed shut, and I heard footsteps moving through the cabin. Panic flooded my mind. He was here for me. There was nowhere to go, no one to call for help. I pressed myself against the wall, my breath shallow and quiet, praying he wouldn't find me. Then I heard him. He was closer now, moving through the rooms. "I just want to talk. You should not have come here." I was trembling, tears welling in my eyes. I couldn't think straight. I needed to get out. The back window was my only option. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding loudly in my chest. I tiptoed toward the window, praying he wouldn't hear me. Just as I reached the window, I heard him again. "You cannot hide forever." I pushed the window open, and it creaked loudly. I froze, praying he wouldn't come to investigate. I squeezed through the opening and dropped down to the ground outside. I landed hard, pain shooting through my ankle, but I had no time to dwell on it. I had to run. I darted away from the cabin, weaving through the trees, trying to remember the way I had come in. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps crunching through the underbrush, growing closer. I stumbled through the woods, branches slapping against my arms and legs, the sting of the leaves sharp against my skin. The sound of my heart filled my ears, drowning out everything else. I ran as fast as I could, adrenaline pushing me forward, until I finally broke into a clearing. Ahead, I saw the road. I could hardly believe it. I pushed myself harder, willing my legs to move faster. I reached the edge of the clearing, my breath ragged as I burst onto the gravel road. I turned to look back, and there he was, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I could see his eyes, cold and predatory. I didn't waste a second. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking. I jumped inside and locked the door, gasping for breath. I turned the key in the ignition and the engine roared to life. I sped away from that cabin, my heart still racing. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him chasing after me. But there was nothing, only the quiet woods disappearing behind me. I left that place, vowing never to return,